earnings with the great growth of the country since pre-war days was a sign of a weakened relative position, which called for a more cautious and exacting attitude by the investor. If he had required his railroad bonds to meet the same tests that he applied to industrial issues, he would have been compelled to confine his selection to a relatively few of the strongly situated lines. As it turned out, nearly all of these have been able to withstand the tremendous loss of traffic since 1929 without danger to their fixed charges. Whether or not this is a case of wisdom after the event is irrelevant to our discussion. Viewing past experience as a lesson for the future, we can see that selecting railroad bonds on a depression basis would mean requiring a larger margin of safety in normal times than was heretofore considered necessary. The 1937 to 1938 experience. These conclusions with respect to railroad and utility bonds are supported by the behavior of the two groups in the 1937 to 1938 recession. Nearly all issues which met reasonably stringent quantitative tests at the beginning of 1937 came through the ensuing slump with a relatively small market decline and no impairment of inherent position. On the other hand, bonds of both groups, showing a substandard earnings coverage for 1936, suffered in most cases a really serious loss of quoted value, which in some instances proved the precursor of financial difficulties for the issuer. 3. Depression performance of industrial bonds. In the case of industrial obligations, the 1937 to 1938 pattern and the 1931 through 1933 pattern are appreciably different, so that the investor's attitude toward this type of security may depend somewhat on whether he feels it necessary to guard against the more or the less serious degree of depression. Studying the 1931 through 1933 record, we note that price collapses were not due primarily to unsound financial structures, as in the case of utility bonds, nor to a miscalculation by investors as to the margin of safety needed, as in the case of railroad bonds. We are confronted, in many cases, by a sudden disappearance of earning power and a disconcerting question as to whether the business can survive. A company such as Gulf States Steel, for example, earned its 1929 interest charges at least 3.5 times in every year from 1922 to 1929. Yet in 1930 and 1931, operating losses were so large as to threaten its solvency. Many basic industries, such as the Cuban sugar producers and our own coal mines, were depressed prior to the 1929 debacle. In the past, such eclipses had always proven to be temporary, and investors felt justified in holding the bonds of these companies in the expectation of a speedy recovery. But in this instance, the continuance of adverse conditions beyond all previous experience defeated their calculations and destroyed the values behind their investment. From these cases, we must conclude that even a high margin of safety in good times may prove ineffective against a succession of operating losses caused by prolonged adversity. The difficulties that befell industrial bonds, therefore, cannot be avoided in the future merely by more stringent requirements as to bond interest coverage in normal years. If we examine more closely the behavior of the industrial bond list in 1932 to 1933, taking all issues listed on the New York Stock Exchange, we shall note that the fraction that maintained a price reflecting reasonable confidence in the safety of the issue was limited to only 18 out of some 200 companies. The majority of these companies were of outstanding importance in their respective industries. This point suggests that large size is a trait of considerable advantage in dealing with exceptionally unfavorable developments in the industrial world, which may mean in turn that industrial investment should be restricted to major companies. The evidence, however, may be objected to on the ground of having been founded on an admittedly abnormal experience. The less drastic test of 1937 to 1938 points rather towards the conventional conclusion that issues strongly buttressed by past earnings can be relied on to withstand depressions. If, however, we go back over a longer period, say since 1915, we shall find perennial evidence of the instability of industrial earning power. Even in the supposedly prosperous period between 1922 and 1929, the bonds of smaller industrial enterprises did not prove a dependable medium of investment. There were many instances wherein an apparently well-established earning power suffered a sudden disappearance. In fact, these unpredictable variations were sufficiently numerous to suggest the conclusion that there is an inherent lack of stability in the small or medium-sized industrial enterprise, which makes them ill-suited to bond financing. A tacit recognition of this weakness has been responsible in part for the growing adoption of conversion and subscription warrant privileges in connection with industrial bond financing. To what extent such embellishments can compensate for insufficient safety will be discussed in our chapters on senior securities with speculative features. But in any event, the widespread resort to these profit-sharing artifices seems to confirm our view that bonds of smaller industrial companies are not well qualified for consideration as fixed-value investments. Unavailability of sound bonds, no excuse for buying poor ones. However, if we recommend that straight bond investment in the industrial field be confined to companies of dominant size, we face the difficulty that such companies are few in number and many of them have no bonds outstanding. It may be objected further that such an attitude would severely handicap the financing of legitimate businesses of secondary size and would have a blighting effect on investment banking activities. The answer to these remonstrances must be that no consideration can justify the purchase of unsound bonds at an investment price. The fact that no good bonds are available is hardly an excuse for either issuing or accepting poor ones. Needless to say, the investor is never forced to buy a security of inferior grade. At some sacrifice in yield, he can always find issues that meet his requirements, however stringent, and, as we shall point out later, attempts to increase yield at the expense of safety are likely to prove unprofitable. From the standpoint of the corporations and their investment bankers, the conclusion must follow that if their securities cannot properly qualify as straight investments, they must be given profit-making possibilities sufficient to compensate the purchaser for the risk he runs. Conflicting views on bond financing. In this connection, observations are in order regarding two generally accepted ideas on the subject of bond financing. The first is that bond issues are an element of weakness in a company's financial position, so that the elimination of funded debt is always a desirable object. The second is that when companies are unable to finance through the sale of stock, it is proper to raise money by means of bond issues. In the writer's view, both of these widespread notions are quite incorrect. Otherwise, there would be no really sound basis for any bond financing, for they imply that only weak companies should be willing to sell bonds, which, if true, would mean that investors should not be willing to buy them. Proper theory of bond financing. The proper theory of bond financing, however, is of quite different import. A reasonable amount of funded debt is of advantage to a prosperous business because the stockholders can earn a profit above interest charges through the use of the bondholder's capital. It is desirable for both the corporation and the investor that the borrowing be limited to an amount which can safely be taken care of under all conditions. Hence, from the standpoint of sound finance, there is no basic conflict of interest between the strong corporation which floats bonds and the public which buys them. On the other hand, whenever an element of unwillingness or compulsion enters into the creation of a bond issue by an enterprise, these bonds are ipso facto of secondary quality, and it is unwise to purchase them on a straight investment basis. Unsound policies followed in practice. Financial policies followed by corporations and accepted by the public have for many years run counter to these logical principles. The railroads, for example, have financed the bulk of their needs through bond sales, resulting in an overbalancing of funded debt as against stock capital. This tendency has been repeatedly deplored by all authorities, but accepted as inevitable because poor earnings made stock sales impracticable. But if the latter were true, They also made bond purchases inadvisable. It is now quite clear that investors were imprudent in lending money to carriers which themselves complained of the necessity of having to borrow it. While investors were thus illogically lending money to weak borrowers, many strong enterprises were paying off their debts through the sale of additional stock. But if there is any thoroughly sound basis for corporate borrowing, then this procedure must also be regarded as unwise. If a reasonable amount of borrowed capital, obtained at low interest rates, is advantageous to the stockholder, then the replacement of this debt by added stock capital means the surrender of such advantage. The elimination of debt will naturally simplify the problems of the management, but surely there must be some point at which the return to the stockholders must also be considered. Were this not so, corporations would be constantly raising money from their owners, and they would never pay any part of it back in dividends. It should be pointed out that the mania for debt retirement in 1927 through 1929 has had a disturbing effect upon our banking situation, since it eliminated most of the good commercial borrowers and replaced them by second-grade business risks and by loans on stock collateral, which were replete with possibilities of harm. Significance of the foregoing to the investor. The above analysis of the course of industrial bond borrowing in the last 15 years is not irrelevant to the theme of this chapter, viz., the application of depression standards to the selection of fixed-value investments. Recognizing the necessity of ultra-stringent criteria of choice in the industrial field, the bond buyer is faced by a further narrowing of eligible issues due to the elimination of funded debt by many of the strongest companies. Clearly, his reaction must not be to accept the issues of less desirable enterprises in the absence of better ones, but rather to refrain from any purchases on an investment basis if the suitable ones are not available. It appears to be a financial axiom that whenever there is money to invest, it is invested, and if the owner cannot find a good security yielding a fair return, he will invariably buy a poor one. But a prudent and intelligent investor should be able to avoid this temptation and reconcile himself to accepting an unattractive yield from the best bonds, in preference to risking his principal in second-grade issues for the sake of a large coupon return. Summary. The rule that bonds should be bought on the basis of their ability to withstand depression has been part of an old investment tradition. It was nearly lost sight of in the prosperous period culminating in 1929, but its importance was made painfully manifest during the following collapse and demonstrated again in the 1937 to 1938 recession. The bonds of reasonably capitalized electric and gas companies have given a satisfactory account of themselves during this decade, and the same is true, to a lesser degree, of the relatively few railroads which showed a large margin above interest charges prior to 1930. In the industrial list, however, even an excellent past record has, in many cases, proved undependable, especially where the company is of small or moderate size. For this reason, the investor would seem to gain better protection against adverse developments by confining his industrial selections to companies which meet the two requirements of 1. Dominant size, and 2. Substantial margin of earnings over bond interest. 3. Third principle. Unsound to sacrifice safety for yield. In the traditional theory of bond investment, a mathematical relationship is supposed to exist between the interest rate and the degree of risk incurred. The interest return is divided into two components, the first constituting pure interest, that is, the rate obtainable with no risk of loss, and the second representing the premium obtained to compensate for the risk assumed. If, for example, the pure interest rate is assumed to be 2%, then a 3% investment is supposed to involve 1 chance in 100 of loss, while the risk incurred in a 7% investment would be 5 times as great, or 1 in 20. Presumably, the risk should be somewhat less than that indicated to allow for an insurance profit. This theory implies that bond interest rates are closely similar to insurance rates and that they measure the degree of risk on some reasonably precise actuarial basis. It would follow that, by and large, the return from high and low-yielding investments should tend to equalize, since what the former gain in income would be offset by their greater percentage of principal losses, and vice versa. No mathematical relationship between yield and risk. This view, however, seems to us to bear little relation to the realities of bond investment. Security prices and yields are not determined by any exact mathematical calculation of the expected risk, but they depend rather upon the popularity of the issue. This popularity reflects in a general way the investor's view as to the risk involved, but it is also influenced largely by other factors, such as the degree of familiarity of the public with the company and the issue, seasoning, and the ease with which the bond can be sold, marketability. It may be pointed out further that the supposed actuarial computation of investment risks is out of the question theoretically as well as in practice. There are no experience tables available by which the expected mortality of various types of issues can be determined. Even if such tables were prepared based on long and exhaustive studies of past records, it is doubtful whether they would have any real utility for the future. In life insurance, the relation between age and mortality rate is well defined and changes only gradually. The same is true, to a much lesser extent, of the relation between the various types of structures and the fire hazard attaching to them. But the relation between different kinds of investments and the risk of loss is entirely too indefinite and too variable with changing conditions to permit of sound mathematical formulation. This is particularly true because investment losses are not distributed fairly evenly in point of time, but tend to be concentrated at intervals, that is, during periods of general depression. Hence, the typical investment hazard is roughly similar to the conflagration or epidemic hazard, which is the exceptional and incalculable factor in fire or life insurance. Self-insurance generally not possible in investment. If we were to assume that a precise mathematical relationship does exist between yield and risk, then the result of this premise should be inevitably to recommend the lowest yielding, and therefore the safest, bonds to all investors, for the individual is not qualified to be an insurance underwriter. It is not his function to be paid for incurring risks. On the contrary, it is to his interest to pay others for insurance against loss. Let us assume a bond buyer has his choice of investing $1,000 for $20 per annum without risk, or for $70 per annum with one chance out of 20 each year that his principal would be lost. The $50 additional income on the second investment is mathematically equivalent to the risk involved. But in terms of personal requirements, an investor cannot afford to take even a small chance of losing $1,000 of principal in return for an extra $50 of income. Such a procedure would be the direct opposite of the standard procedure of paying small annual sums to protect property values against loss by fire and theft. The factor of cyclical risks. The investor cannot prudently turn himself into an insurance company and incur risks of losing his principal in exchange for annual premiums in the form of extra-large interest coupons. One objection to such a policy is that sound insurance practice requires a very wide distribution of risk in order to minimize the influence of luck and to allow maximum play to the law of probability. The investor may endeavor to attain this end by diversifying his holdings, but as a practical matter he cannot approach the division of risk attained by an insurance company. More important still is the danger that many risky investments may collapse together in a depression period, so that the investor in high-yielding issues will find a period of large income, which he will probably spend, followed suddenly by a deluge of losses in principal. It may be contended that the higher-yielding securities on the whole return a larger premium above pure interest than the degree of risk requires. In other words, that in return for taking the risk, investors will in the long run obtain a profit over and above the losses of principal suffered. It is difficult to say definitely whether or not this is true, But even assuming that the high coupon rates will, in the great aggregate, more than compensate on an actuarial basis for the risks accepted, such bonds are still undesirable investments from the personal standpoint of the average investor. Our arguments against the investor turning himself into an insurance company remain valid even if the insurance operations all told may prove profitable. The bond buyer is neither financially nor psychologically equipped to carry on extensive transactions involving the setting up of reserves out of regular income to absorb losses in substantial amounts suffered at irregular intervals. Risk and yield are incommensurable. The foregoing discussion leads us to suggest the principle that income return and risk of principal should be regarded as incommensurable. Practically speaking, this means that acknowledged risks of losing principal should not be offset merely by a high coupon rate, but can be accepted only in return for a corresponding opportunity for enhancement of principal. For example, through the purchase of bonds at a substantial discount from par, or possibly by obtaining an unusually attractive conversion privilege. While there may be no real mathematical difference between offsetting risks of loss by a higher income or by a chance for profit, the psychological difference is very important. The purchaser of low-priced bonds is fully aware of the risk he is running. He is more likely to make a thorough investigation of the issue and to appraise carefully the chances of loss and of profit. Finally, most important of all, he is prepared for whatever losses he may sustain, and his profits are in a form available to meet his losses. Actual investment experience, therefore, will not favor the purchase of the typical high-coupon bond offered at about par, wherein, for example, a 7% interest return is imagined to compensate for a distinctly inferior grade of security. Fallacy of the businessman's investment. An issue of this type is commonly referred to in the financial world as a businessman's investment and is supposedly suited to those who can afford to take some degree of risk. Most of the foreign bonds floated between 1923 and 1929 belonged in that category. The same is true of the great bulk of straight preferred stock issues. According to our view, such businessman's investments are an illogical type of commitment. The security buyer who can afford to take some risk should seek a commensurate opportunity of enhancement in price and pay only secondary attention to the income obtained. Reversal of customary procedure recommended. Viewing the matter more broadly, it would be well if investors reversed their customary attitude toward income return. In selecting the grade of bonds suitable to their situation, they are prone to start at the top of the list where maximum safety is combined with lowest yield, and then to calculate how great a concession from ideal security they are willing to make for the sake of a more attractive income rate. From this point of view, the ordinary investor becomes accustomed to the idea that the type of issue suited to his needs must rank somewhere below the very best, a frame of mind which is likely to lead to the acceptance of definitely unsound bonds, either because of their high income return or by surrender to the blandishments of the bond salesman. It would be sounder procedure to start with minimum standards of safety, which all bonds must be required to meet in order to be eligible for further consideration. Issues failing to meet these minimum requirements should be automatically disqualified as straight investments, regardless of high yield, attractive prospects, or other grounds for partiality. Having thus delimited the field of eligible investments, the buyer may then apply such further selective processes as he deems appropriate. He may desire elements of safety far beyond the accepted minima, in which case he must ordinarily make some sacrifice of yield. He may also indulge his preferences as to the nature of the business and the character of the management. But essentially, bond selection should consist of working upward from definite minimum standards rather than working downward in haphazard fashion from some ideal but unacceptable level of maximum security. Chapter 8. Specific Standards for Bond Investment. 4. Fourth principle. Definite standards of safety must be applied. Since the selection of high-grade bonds has been shown to be in good part a process of exclusion, it lends itself reasonably well to the application of definite rules and standards designed to disqualify unsuitable issues. Such regulations have in fact been set up in many states by legislative enactment to govern the investments made by savings banks and by trust funds. In most states, the banking department prepares each year a list of securities which appear to conform to these regulations and are therefore considered legal, that is, eligible for purchase under the statute. It is our view that the underlying idea of fixed standards and minima should be extended to the entire field of straight investment, that is, investment for income only. These legislative restrictions are intended to promote a high average level of investment quality and to protect depositors and beneficiaries against losses from unsafe securities. If such regulations are desirable in the case of institutions, it should be logical for individuals to follow them also. We have previously challenged the prevalent idea that the ordinary investor can afford to take greater investment risks than a savings bank and need not therefore be as exacting with respect to the soundness of his fixed value securities. The experience since 1928 undoubtedly emphasizes the need for a general tightening of investment standards, and a simple method of attaining this end might be to confine all straight bond selections to those which meet the legal tests of eligibility for savings banks or trust funds. Such a procedure would appear directly consonant with our fundamental principle that straight investments should be made only in issues of unimpeachable soundness, and that securities of inferior grade must be bought only on an admittedly speculative basis. New York savings bank law is a point of departure. As a matter of practical policy, an individual bond buyer is likely to obtain fairly satisfactory results by subjecting himself to the restrictions which govern the investment of savings banks' funds. But this procedure cannot be seriously suggested as a general principle of investment because the legislative provisions are themselves far too imperfect to warrant their acceptance as the best available theoretical standards. The acts of the various states are widely divergent. Most of them are antiquated in important respects. None is entirely logical or scientific. The legislators did not approach their task from the viewpoint of establishing criteria of sound investments for universal use. Consequently, they felt free to impose arbitrary restrictions on savings bank and trust funds, which they would have hesitated to prescribe for investors generally. The New York statute, generally regarded as the best of its class, is nevertheless marred by a number of evident defects. In the formulation of comprehensive investment standards, the New York legislation may best be used, therefore, as a guide or point of departure rather than as a final authority. The ensuing discussion will follow fairly closely the pattern set forth in the statutory provisions as they existed in 1939, but these will be criticized, rejected, or amplified whenever such emendation appears desirable. General criteria prescribed by the New York statute. The specific requirements imposed by the statute upon bond investments may be classified under 7 heads, which we shall proceed to enumerate and discuss. 1. The nature and location of the business or government. 2. The size of the enterprise or the issue. 3. The terms of the issue. 4. The record of solvency and dividend payments. 5. The relation of earnings to interest requirements. 6. The relation of the value of the property to the funded debt. 7. The relation of stock capitalization to the funded debt. Nature and location. The most striking features of the laws governing savings bank investments is the complete exclusion of bonds in certain broad categories. The New York provisions relative to permitted and prohibited classes may be summarized as follows, subject to a 1938 amendment soon to be discussed. Admitted: United States government, state, and municipal bonds, railroad bonds, and electric, gas, and telephone mortgage bonds, bonds secured by first mortgages on real estate. Excluded: foreign government and foreign corporation bonds, street railway and water bonds, debentures of public utilities, all industrial bonds, bonds of financial companies, investment trusts, credit concerns, etc. The fallacy of blanket prohibitions. The legislature was evidently of the view that bonds belonging to the excluded categories are essentially too unstable to be suited to savings bank investment. If this view is entirely sound, it would follow from our previous reasoning that all issues in these groups are unsuited to conservative investment generally. Such a conclusion would involve revolutionary changes in the field of finance, since a large part of the capital now regularly raised in the investment market would have to be sought on an admittedly speculative basis. In our opinion, a considerable narrowing of the investment category is in fact demanded by the unsatisfactory experience of bond investors over a fairly long period. Nevertheless, there are strong objections to the application of blanket prohibitions of the kind now under discussion. Investment theory should be chary of easy generalizations. Even if full recognition is given, for example, to the unstable tendencies of industrial bonds as discussed in Chapter 7, the elimination of this entire major group from investment consideration would seem neither practicable nor desirable. The existence of a fair number of industrial issues, even though a small percentage of the total, which have maintained an undoubted investment status through the severest tests, would preclude investors generally from adopting so drastic a policy. Moreover, the confining of investment demand to a few eligible types of enterprise is likely to make for scarcity, and hence for the acceptance of inferior issues merely because they fall within these groups. This has, in fact, been one of the unfortunate results of the present legislative restrictions. Individual strength may compensate for inherent weakness of a class. It would seem a sounder principle, therefore, to require a stronger exhibit by the individual bond to compensate for any weakness supposedly inherent in its class, rather than to seek to admit all bonds of certain favored groups and to exclude all bonds of others. An industrial bond may properly be required to show a larger margin of earnings over interest charges and a smaller proportion of debt to going concern value than would be required of an obligation of a gas or electric enterprise. The same would apply in the case of traction bonds. In connection with the exclusion of water company bonds by the New York statute, it should be noted that this group is considered by most other states to be on a par with gas, electric, and telephone obligations. There seems to be no good reason for subjecting them to more stringent requirements than in the case of other types of public service issues. The 1938 Amendment to the Banking Law. In 1938, the New York legislature, recognizing the validity of these objections to categorical exclusions, proceeded to relieve the situation in a rather peculiar manner. It decreed that the banking board could authorize savings banks to invest in interest-bearing obligations not otherwise eligible for investment, provided application for such authorization shall have been made by not less than 20 savings banks or by a trust company, all of the capital stock of which is owned by not less than 20 savings banks. This meant the Savings Bank Trust Company of New York. Clearly, this amendment goes much farther than a mere widening of the categories of savings bank investment. What it does, in fact, is to supersede, potentially at least, all the specific requirements of the law, other than the primary insistence on interest-paying bonds, by the combined judgment of the savings banks themselves and the banking board. This means that, in theory, all 7 of the criteria imposed by the law may be set aside by agreement of the parties. Obviously, there is no practical danger that the legislative wisdom of the statute will be completely flouted. In fact, investments authorized by virtue of this new provision up to the end of 1939 are all unexceptionable in character. They include previously ineligible debenture issues of very strong telephone and industrial companies. Curiously enough, no industrial mortgage bond has as yet been approved, But this may serve to confirm our previous statement that good industrial bonds are likely to be debentures. The action to date under the 1938 amendment has represented a praiseworthy departure from the unduly narrow restrictions of the statute itself, which we have criticized above. We are by no means convinced, however, that the legislation, as it now stands, is in really satisfactory form. There seems to be something puerile about enacting a long list of rules and then permitting an administrative body to waive as many of them as it sees fit. Would it not be better to prescribe a few really important criteria which must be followed in every instance, and then give the banking board discretionary power to exclude issues that meet these minimum requirements but still are not sound enough in its conservative judgment? Obligations of foreign governments. We have argued against any broad exclusions of entire categories of bonds, but in dealing with foreign government debts, a different type of reasoning may conceivably be justified. Such issues respond in but small degree to financial analysis, and investment therein is ordinarily based on general considerations, such as confidence in the country's economic and political stability and the belief that it will faithfully endeavor to discharge its obligations. To a much greater extent, therefore, than in the case of other bonds, an opinion may be justified or even necessitated as to the general desirability of foreign government bonds for fixed value investment. The factor of political expediency. Viewing objectively the history of foreign bond investment in this country since it first assumed importance during the World War, it is difficult to escape an unfavorable conclusion on this point. In the final analysis, a foreign government debt is an unenforceable contract. If payment is withheld, the bondholder has no direct remedy. Even if specific revenues or assets are pledged as security, he is practically helpless in the event that these pledges are broken. It follows that while a foreign government obligation is in theory a claim against the entire resources of the nation, the extent to which these resources are actually drawn upon to meet the external debt burden is found to depend in good part on political expediency. The grave international dislocations of the post-war period made some defaults inevitable and supplied the pretext for others. In any event, because non-payment has become a familiar phenomenon, its very frequency has removed much of the resultant obloquy. Hence, the investor has seemingly less reason than of old to rely upon Herculean efforts being made by a foreign government to live up to its obligations during difficult times. The foreign trade argument. It is generally argued that a renewal of large-scale international lending is necessary to restore world equilibrium. More concretely, such lending appears to be an indispensable adjunct to the restoration and development of our export trade. But the investor should not be expected to make unsound commitments for idealistic reasons or to benefit American exporters. As a speculative operation, the purchase of foreign obligations at low prices, such as prevailed in 1932, might prove well justified by the attendant possibilities of profit. But these tremendously depreciated quotations are in themselves a potent argument against later purchases of new foreign issues at a price close to 100% of face value, no matter how high the coupon rate may be set. The individual record argument. It may be contended, however, that investment in foreign obligations is essentially similar to any other form of investment in that it requires discrimination and judgment. Some nations deserve a high credit rating based on their past performance, and these are entitled to investment preference to the same degree as are domestic corporations with satisfactory records. The legislatures of several states have recognized the superior standing of Canada by authorizing savings banks to purchase its obligations, and Vermont has accepted also the dollar bonds of Belgium, Denmark, Great Britain, Holland, and Switzerland. A strong argument in the contrary direction is supplied by the appended list of the various countries having debts payable in dollars, classified according to the credit rating indicated by the market action of their bonds during the severe test of 1932. 1. Countries whose bonds sold on an investment basis: Canada, France, Great Britain, Netherlands, Switzerland. 2. countries whose bonds sold on a speculative basis: Argentina, Australia, Austria, Bolivia, Brazil, Bulgaria, Chile, China, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Guatemala, Greece, Haiti, Hungary, Japan, Yugoslavia, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Peru, Poland, Romania, Russia, Salvador, Uruguay. 3. Borderline countries: Belgium, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Sweden. Of the 5 countries in the first or investment group, the credit of 2, viz. France and Great Britain, was considered speculative in the preceding depression of 1921 to 1922. Out of 42 countries represented, therefore, only 3, Canada, Holland, and Switzerland, enjoyed an unquestioned investment rating during the 12 years ending in 1932. Twofold objection to purchase of foreign government bonds. This evidence suggests that the purchase of foreign government bonds is subject to a twofold objection of generic character. Theoretically, in that the basis for credit is fundamentally intangible, and practically, in that experience with the foreign group has been preponderantly unsatisfactory. Apparently, it will require a considerable betterment of world conditions, demonstrated by a fairly long period of punctual discharge of international obligations, to warrant a revision of this unfavorable attitude toward foreign bonds as a class. Canadian issues may undoubtedly be exempted from this blanket condemnation, both on their record and because of the closeness of the relationship between Canada and the United States. Individual investors, for either personal or statistical reasons, may be equally convinced of the high credit standing of various other countries, and will therefore be ready to purchase their obligations as high-grade investments. Such commitments may prove to be fully justified by the facts, but for some years at least it would be well if the investor approached them in the light of exceptions to a general rule of avoiding foreign bonds, and required them accordingly to present exceptionally strong evidence of stability and safety. Bonds of foreign corporations. In theory, bonds of a corporation, however prosperous, cannot enjoy better security than the obligations of the country in which the corporation is located. The government, through its taxing power, has an unlimited prior claim upon the assets and earnings of the business. In other words, it can take the property away from the private bondholder and utilize it to discharge the national debt. But in actuality, distinct limits are imposed by political expediency upon the exercise of the taxing power. Accordingly, we find instances of corporations meeting their dollar obligations even when their government is in default. Foreign corporation bonds have an advantage over governmental bonds in that the holder enjoys specific legal remedies in the event of non-payment, such as the right of foreclosure. Consequently, it is probably true that a foreign company is under greater compulsion to meet its debt than is a sovereign nation. But it must be recognized that the conditions resulting in the default of government obligations are certain to affect adversely the position of the corporate bondholder. Restrictions on the transfer of funds may prevent the payment of interest in dollars, even though the company may remain amply solvent. Furthermore, the distance separating the creditor from the property and the obstacles interposed by governmental decree are likely to destroy the practical value of his mortgage security. For these reasons, the unfavorable conclusions reached with respect to foreign government obligations as fixed-value investments must be considered as applicable also to foreign corporation bonds. Size. The bonds of very small enterprises are subject to objections which disqualify them as media for conservative investment. A company of relatively minor size is more vulnerable than others to unexpected happenings, and it is likely to be handicapped by the lack of strong banking connections or of technical resources. Very small businesses, therefore, have never been able to obtain public financing and have depended on private capital, those supplying the funds being given the double inducement of a share in the profits and a direct voice in the management. The objections to bonds of undersized corporations apply also to tiny villages or microscopic townships. and the careful investor in municipal obligations will ordinarily avoid those below a certain population level. The establishment of such minimum requirements as to size necessarily involves the drawing of arbitrary lines of demarcation. There is no mathematical means of determining exactly at what point a company or a municipality becomes large enough to warrant the investor's attention. The same difficulty will attach to setting up any other quantitative standards, as, for example, the margin of earnings above interest charges or the relation of stock or property values to bonded debt. It must be borne in mind, therefore, that all these critical points are necessarily rule of thumb decisions, and the investor is free to use other amounts if they appeal to him more. But however arbitrary the standards selected may be, they are undoubtedly of great practical utility in safeguarding the bond buyer from inadequately protected issues. Provisions of New York statute. The New York statute has prescribed various standards as to minimum size in defining investments eligible for savings banks. As regards municipal bonds, a population of not less than 10,000 is required for states adjacent to New York, and of 30,000 for other states. Railroads must either own 500 miles of standard gauge line or else have operating revenues of not less than $10 million per annum. Unsecured and income bonds of railroad companies are admitted only if, among other special requirements, the net income available for dividends amounts to $10 million. For gas and electric companies, gross revenues must have averaged $1 million per year during the preceding 5 years. But in the case of telephone bonds, this figure must be $5 million. There are further provisions to the effect that the size of the bond issue itself must not be less than $1 million for gas and electric companies, and not less than $5 million in the case of telephone obligations. Some criticisms of these requirements. The figures of minimum gross receipts do not appear well chosen from the standpoint of bond investment in general. The distinctions as to population requirements would scarcely appeal to investors throughout the country. The alternative tests for railroads, based on either mileage or revenues, are confusing and unnecessary. The $10 million gross requirement by itself is too high. It would have eliminated, for example, the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, one of the few lines to make a satisfactory exhibit during the 1930 to 1933 Depression as well as before. Equally unwarranted is the requirement of $5 million gross for telephone concerns, as against only $1 million for gas and electric utilities. This provision would have ruled out the bonds of Tri-State Telephone and Telegraph Company prior to 1927, although they were then, and since, obligations of unquestioned merit. We believe that the following proposed requirements for minimum size, although by necessity arbitrarily taken, are in reasonable accord with the realities of sound investment. Municipalities. Minimum requirement of size, 10,000 population. Public utility enterprises, $2 million gross. Railroad systems, $3 million gross. Industrial companies, $5 million gross. Industrial bonds and the factor of size. Since industrial bonds are not eligible for savings banks under the New York law, no minimum size is therein prescribed. We have expressed the view that industrial obligations may be included among high-grade investments provided they meet stringent tests of safety. The experience of the past decade indicates that dominant, or at least substantial size, affords an element of protection against the hazards of instability to which industrial enterprises are more subject than are railroads or public utilities. A cautious investor seeking to profit from recent lessons would apparently be justified in deciding to confine his purchases of fixed-value bonds to perhaps the half-dozen leading units in each industrial group, and also perhaps in adding the suggested minimum requirement of $5 million annual sales. Such minimum standards may be criticized as unduly stringent in that if they were universally applied, which in any event is unlikely, They would make it impossible for sound and prosperous businesses of moderate size to finance themselves through straight bond issues. It is conceivable that a general stabilization of industrial conditions in the United States may invalidate the conclusions derived from the extreme variations of the past 10 years. But until such a tendency in the direction of stability has actually demonstrated itself, we should favor a highly exacting attitude toward the purchase of industrial bonds at investment levels. Large size alone, no guarantee of safety. These recommendations on the subject of minimum size do not imply that enormous dimensions are in themselves a guarantee of prosperity and financial strength. The biggest company may be the weakest if its bonded debt is disproportionately large. Moreover, in the railroad, public utility, and municipal groups, no practical advantage attaches to the very largest units as compared with those of medium magnitude. Whether the gross receipts of an electric company are 20 millions or 100 millions has, in all probability, no material effect on the safety of its bonds, and, similarly, a town of 75,000 inhabitants may deserve better credit than would a city of several millions. It is only in the industrial field that we have suggested that the bonds of a very large enterprise may be inherently more desirable than those of middle-sized companies. But even here, a thoroughly satisfactory statistical showing on the part of the large company is necessary to make this advantage a dependable one. Other provisions rejected. The New York statute includes an additional requirement in respect to unsecured railroad bonds, viz., that the net earnings after interest charge must equal $10 million. This does not appear to us to be justified, since we have previously argued against attaching particular significance to the possession or lack of mortgage security. There is a certain logical fallacy also in the further prescription of a minimum size for the bond issue itself in the case of public utilities. If the enterprise is large enough as measured by its gross business, then the smaller the bond issue, the easier it would be to meet interest and principal requirements. The legislature probably desired to avoid the inferior marketability associated with very small issues. In our view, the element of marketability is generally given too much stress by investors, and in this case, we do not favor following the statutory requirement with respect to the size of the issue as a general rule for bond investment. Chapter 9. Specific Standards for Bond Investment. The provisions of the issue. Under this heading come such features as the security of the bonds, the conditions affecting interest payments, and the date of maturity. Conversion and similar privileges specified in the indenture are, of course, important in themselves, but they do not enter into the determination of standards for the selection of fixed-value investments. Under the New York statute, only bonds secured by mortgage are eligible in the public utility group. However, debenture, unsecured railroad bonds are admitted, provided the earnings and dividend record meet stiffer requirements than are set forth for mortgage issues. The statute also permits the purchase of income bonds, that is, those on which the obligation to pay interest is dependent upon earnings, on the same basis as debentures. Obsolete and illogical restrictions. In our opinion, this set of restrictions is quite out of date and illogical. In view of our emphatic argument in Chapter 6 against attaching predominant weight to specific security, it must be clear that we do not favor the exclusion of any group of unsecured bond issues per se, or even the establishment of any sharply defined standards or requirements which favor secured bonds over debentures. If a company has only one bond issue, it would seem to make little difference whether this is a first mortgage or a debenture, provided the latter is protected against the placing of future issues ahead of it. Needless to say, a debenture bond preceded by a first mortgage is not so attractive as the first mortgage bond itself, even though the investor's chief reliance in both cases must be the same, that is, the ability of the company to meet all its obligations. but this distinction would be equally applicable to a second mortgage issue, and hence is not concerned with debentures as such. We have already discussed the practicalities of selecting as between senior and junior liens, and shall refer to this point again when we consider interest coverage. Income bonds in weaker position than debentures. While the New York statute is too severe in its categorical exclusion of all unsecured public utility issues, its acceptance of railroad income issues on the same basis as railroad debentures is fully as objectionable for the opposite reason. The provisions of income bonds vary greatly among the different issues, the basic distinction being between those on which interest must be paid if earned and those over which the directors have a greater or lesser measure of discretion. Generally speaking, income bonds are allied more closely to preferred stocks than to ordinary fixed obligations. We shall consider them accordingly in our chapter on preferred stocks, in which we shall set forth the need for a special caution and strictness in the selection of this type of security for straight investment. Standards of safety should not be relaxed because of early maturity. Investors are inclined to attach considerable importance to the maturity date of an issue because of its bearing on whether it is a short or long-term security. A short maturity carrying with it the right to repayment soon after purchase is considered an advantageous feature from the standpoint of safety. Consequently, investors are prone to be less exacting in their standards when purchasing notes or bonds due in a short time, say up to 3 years, than in their other bond selections. In our opinion, this distinction is unsound. A near maturity means a problem of refinancing for the company as well as a privilege of repayment for the investor. The bondholder cannot count on the mere fact of maturity to assure this repayment. The company must either have the cash available, which happens relatively seldom, or else an earning power and financial position which will permit it to raise new funds. Corporations frequently sell short-term issues because their credit is too poor at the time to permit of a long-term flotation at a reasonable rate. Such a practice frequently results in trouble for the company and therefore for the investor at maturity. Examples: the Fisk Rubber Company sold $10 million of 5-year 5.5s in 1926. In 1929, they sold at 96 because of their near maturity, although the company's earnings exhibit was unsatisfactory. But payment of principal was defaulted at maturity in 1931. The company went into receivership, and the price of the notes fell to 10 3/4 in that year. In 1929, the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railway, nickel plate, sold $20 million of 3-year 6% notes. They have been repeatedly extended, but only with great difficulty and upon threat of insolvency if the holders refused to extend. In 1936, they sold as low as 26 3/4. A recent example of apparently unwarranted partiality accorded by the bond market to an issue of near maturity is supplied by Pennsylvania-Dixie Cement Company First Sixes, due September 1941, which in early 1939 sold above par. This issue had barely covered interest charges on a reduced depreciation basis in 1937 and 1938, and had reported deficits in the 6 preceding years. Net current assets were less than the outstanding bonds. It was possible, of course, that conditions in 1941 might permit the repayment of this security, but those who bought it at a full price in 1939 were undoubtedly taking an unnecessary risk of severe shrinkage of principal value. Distinctions between short and long maturities of the same issue. There have been quite a number of cases in which investors have been willing to pay much higher prices for a short-term issue than for an equally secured long-term issue of the same company. In nearly every case, this has proved a mistake, because either 1, the company's credit improved, in which case the distant maturity had a much greater rise in price, or else 2, the company was unable to pay off the short-term issue at maturity. Because of the foregoing discussion, we advise against the drawing of distinctions between long and short-term issues such as result in any relaxation of standards of safety in the selection of issues of the latter type. Record of interest and dividend payments. Bonds purchased on an investment basis should have behind them a sufficiently long record of successful operation and of financial stability on the part of the issuer. New enterprises and those recently emerged from financial difficulties are not entitled to the high credit rating essential to justify a fixed value investment. A similar disqualification would logically apply to states or municipalities which have failed to meet their obligations punctually at any time over a preceding period of years. Provisions of New York statute. The New York statute recognizes this criterion and gives it concrete expression as follows. Bonds of states other than New York are eligible if the state has not defaulted on interest or principal payments during the previous 10 years. For municipalities outside New York State, the period is 25 years. For railroads, 6 years. For gas, electric, and telephone companies, 8 years. With respect to bonds of corporations, however, the requirements as to earnings coverage, to be discussed under the next heading, should adequately take care of the question of past record. The time covered by the earnings requirement is only a little shorter than the periods above suggested, and hence it would seem an unnecessary complication to exact a past solvency test in addition to an earnings test. Civil obligations, on the other hand, are not sold on the basis of an earnings record. Consequently, the investor is compelled to attach primary importance to a satisfactory history of punctual payment. The requirement on this point set forth in the New York statute would no doubt appear reasonable to the average investor. We cannot recommend such a rule of investment, however, without considering the results that would follow from its general adoption. If all purchases of municipal bonds required a clean record for 25 years, how could any township float a bond issue during the first quarter century of its existence? And similarly, if a state or city has been driven into default, how will it finance itself during the 10 or 25 years respectively needed to restore its obligations to the eligible list? In the case of corporations, such financing might be accomplished on a speculative basis, through the sale of stock, or convertible bonds, or even bonds at a large discount. But such methods are not open to municipalities. The difficulty is met in actual practice by raising the coupon rate on the obligations of states or municipalities with inferior credit. For example, a city emerging from financial embarrassment might be able to attract new funds by offering a 5% coupon rate in contrast with 2% paid by New York State. But this solution of the problem runs counter to the principle previously developed that a high coupon rate is not adequate compensation for the assumption of substantial risk of principal. In other words, it would be a mistake to buy a municipal obligation for its high yield if it is recognized as inferior in grade and subject to more than a nominal possibility of default. A dilemma and a suggested solution. We are faced, therefore, by a dilemma, since the theoretically correct attitude of the bond buyer would render impossible the necessary financing of many municipalities. Viewing the matter realistically, it may be dismissed with the observation that there will always be enough undiscriminating investors on hand to absorb the bonds of any town or village which offers a seemingly attractive rate. Consequently, the logical and careful bond buyer can avoid such issues without fatal results to borrowers having second-rate credit. This disposition of the dilemma is too cynical to be entirely satisfactory. The ideal solution would probably lie in setting up some especially stringent quantitative tests to compensate for the failure by a municipality to meet the 25-year requirement of punctual payment. If a city has fallen into financial difficulties, it must rehabilitate itself by reducing its expenditures, or by raising its tax rate and other revenue, or possibly by a compulsory scaling down of its debt, corresponding to a corporate reorganization. By such means, the town may place its finances on an entirely new and sound basis, entitling it to a satisfactory credit rating in spite of its previous default. But the prudent investor will accord such a credit rating only after a careful study of the financial exhibit, including such items as the relation of expenditures and total debt on the one hand to population, property values, and revenues on the other. The bond buyer should expect to obtain a higher than standard yield on municipal obligations of this character in repayment not for the assumption of special risk, but for the effort required to satisfy himself of the soundness of the issue. A similar attitude should be taken towards newly organized civil bodies where only a short record of debt service is available. The dividend record. The statutes governing legal investments have traditionally laid great stress upon a satisfactory record of dividend payments by the issuing enterprise. In most states, a bond is eligible only if the company has paid regular dividends in certain minimum amounts for at least 5 years. This requirement is evidently based on the theory that since corporations exist in order to pay dividends, only those which do in fact pay dividends may be said to be really successful and therefore suitable for bond investment. Dividend record not conclusive evidence of financial strength. It may not be denied that dividend-paying concerns as a class are more prosperous than non-dividend payers, but this fact would not in itself justify the summary condemnation of all the bonds of non-dividend-paying enterprises. An exceedingly strong argument against such a rule lies in the fact that the payment of dividends is only an indication of financial strength, and not only does it fail to afford any direct advantage to the bondholder, but it may often be injurious to his interests by reducing the corporation's resources. In actual practice, the dividend provisions of the statutes governing legal investments have at times had consequences directly opposite to those intended. Railroad companies in a weak financial position have improvidently continued dividend payments for the particular purpose of maintaining their bonds on the eligible list, so that the very practice supposed to indicate strength behind the bond has, in reality, undermined its safety. The role of the dividend record in bond investment. The evidence given by the balance sheet and income account must be regarded as a more dependable clue to the soundness of an enterprise than is the record of dividend payments. It seems best, therefore, to dispense with all hard and fast rules on the latter point in determining the suitability of bond issues for straight investment. But the failure of a company to pay dividends when the earnings appear satisfactory should properly cause an intending bond buyer to scrutinize the situation with more than usual care in order to discover whether the policy of the directors is due to weak elements in the picture not yet reflected in the income account. We might also point out, incidentally, that the bonds of dividend-paying companies possess a certain mechanical advantage in that their owners may receive a definite and perhaps timely warning of impending trouble by the later passing of the dividend, and being thus placed on their guard, they may be able to protect themselves against serious loss. Bonds of non-dividend paying concerns are at a certain disadvantage in this respect, but in our opinion this may be adequately offset by the exercise of somewhat greater caution on the part of the investor. The New York statute is somewhat more progressive than those of other states in its treatment of the dividend question. Railroads are required alternatively either to have paid dividends of a certain amount in 5 out of the last 6 years or, failing this, to meet more stringent requirements as to coverage of fixed charges. Public utility companies are required either to have paid certain dividends in each of the 5 preceding years or else to have earned an amount equal thereto. This provision falls into the error of the other statutes by possibly impelling payment of unearned dividends. The progressive idea appears in the converse side of the provision, which waives payment of dividends so long as they are earned. Relation of earnings to interest requirements. The present-day investor is accustomed to regard the ratio of earnings to interest charges as the most important specific test of safety. It is to be expected, therefore, that any detailed legislation governing the selection of bond investments would be sure to include minimum requirements in respect to this cardinal factor. Nevertheless, the majority of the statutes cover this point in only a fragmentary and inadequate manner. The legislatures have relied to a considerable extent on their requirements as to the company's dividend record to assure satisfactory earning power. As we have just pointed out, this criterion is open to serious objection. The superiority of the New York statute is manifest chiefly in two provisions. First, its recognition of the prime importance of an adequate earnings record, and secondly, its consistent treatment of a company's total fixed charges as an indivisible unit. Requirements of the New York law. The requirements of the New York law with respect to earnings coverage may be summarized as follows. In the case of railroad mortgage bonds, or collateral trust bonds equivalent thereto, and railroad equipment obligations, the company must have earned its fixed charges 1.5 times in 5 out of the 6 years immediately preceding, and also in the latest year. If dividends have not been paid as stipulated, then the period is set at 9 out of the 10 preceding years. In the case of other kinds of railroad bonds, for example, debentures, income obligations, etc., the fixed charges, plus interest on income bonds, if any, must be earned twice in both the latest year and in 5 out of the 6 preceding years. In this category, the requirement as to dividend payments is apparently absolute, and no substitute therefore is admitted. In the case of gas, electric, and telephone bonds, the average earnings for the past 5 years must have equaled twice the average total interest charges, and the same coverage must have been shown in the latest year. 3 phases of the earnings coverage. 1. Method of computation. In analyzing these statutory provisions, 3 elements deserve consideration. The first is the method of computing the earnings coverage. The second is the amount of coverage required, and the third is the period required for the test. The prior deductions method. Various methods are in common use for computing and stating the relation of earnings to interest charges. One of these, which may be called the prior deductions method, is thoroughly objectionable. Nevertheless, prior to 1933, it was followed by the majority of issuing houses in their circulars offering junior bonds for sale because it makes for a deceptively strong exhibit. The procedure consists of first deducting the prior charges from the earnings and then calculating the number of times the junior requirements are covered by the balance. The following illustration will show both the method itself and its inherent absurdity. Company A has $10 million of first mortgage 5% bonds and $5 million of debenture 6% bonds. Its average earnings are $1,400,000. Deduct interest on first fives, $500,000 earned 2.8 times. Balance for debenture sixes, $900,000. Interest on debenture sixes, $300,000 earned 3 times. A circular offering the 6% debenture issue was likely to state that, as shown above, the interest charges are covered 3 times. It should be noted, however, that the interest on the first fives is covered only 2.8 times. The implication of these figures would be that the junior issue is better protected than the senior issue, which is clearly absurd. The fact is that the results shown for junior bonds by this prior deductions method are completely valueless and misleading. One of the favorable results of the Securities Act of 1933 has been the abandonment of this indefensible method of stating interest coverage in new bond offerings. This change has been due apparently not to any specific prohibition by the statute or the SEC regulations, but rather to the desire to avoid risking penalties for deceit. Some Canadian bond offering circulars still use the prior deductions method. Example, Famous Players Canadian Corporation Limited First and Collateral Trust Bonds Series A, offered about June 1936. The cumulative deductions method. The second procedure may be called the cumulative deductions method. Under this method, interest on a junior bond is always considered in conjunction with prior and equivalent charges. In the example given, the interest on the debenture 6s would be computed as earned 1 3/4 times, found by dividing the combined charges of both issues, namely $800,000, into the available earnings of $1,400,000. The first mortgage interest, however, would be said to be earned 2.8 times, since bond interest junior to the issue analyzed is left out of consideration in this method. The majority of investors would regard this point of view as entirely sound, and the procedure has been specifically prescribed by a number of states in their enactments governing the eligibility of bonds for savings bank investment. The total deductions or overall method. In a previous chapter, however, we have emphasized the primary importance of a company's ability to meet all its fixed obligations, because insolvency resulting from default on a junior lien invariably reacts to the disadvantage of the prior mortgage bondholders. An investor can be sure of his position only if the total interest charges are well covered. Consequently, the conservative and therefore advisable way of calculating interest coverage should always be by the total deductions method. That is, the controlling figure should be the number of times that all fixed charges are covered. This would mean that the same earnings ratio would be used in analyzing all the fixed interest bonds of any company, whether they are senior or junior liens. In the example above given, the ratio would be 1 3/4 as applied to either the first 5s or the debenture 6s. In bond circulars and annual reports, this method is now commonly referred to as the overall basis for computing interest coverage. It is important to bear in mind that fixed charges exclude income bond interest, which is a contingent charge. The words interest charges and bonded debt are also used for convenience, to refer only to fixed interest bonds unless the context indicates otherwise. There is no reason, of course, why the coverage for a senior bond should not be computed by the cumulative deductions method also, and if this coverage is very large, it may properly be regarded as an added argument in favor of the issue. But our recommendation is that in applying any minimum requirement designed to test the company's strength, the total fixed charges should always be taken into account. The New York statute holds consistently to this very stand, and in our opinion it deserves to be approved and followed. 2. Minimum requirements for earnings coverage. The preference accorded by the New York statute to railroad bonds over public utility issues is no longer justified, and the more recent record of both groups suggests that their relative positions should be reversed. It is necessary also to add a minimum figure for industrial bonds, which should clearly be set higher than for either utilities or rails. Taking these factors into account, we should recommend the following minimum requirements for the coverage of total fixed charges. Public utilities, 1 3/4 times. Railroads, 2 times. Industrials, 3 times. 3. The period comprised by the earnings test. Our summary of the New York provisions regarding earnings coverage pointed out that the 5-year average is used in the case of utility issues. For railroad bonds, however, the stipulated minimum margin must be shown in 5 separate years out of the latest 6. In all instances, the minimum must be met in the year immediately preceding the date of investment. Requirements such as the last 2 are easy to promulgate, but they are poorly suited to the realities of bond investment in an economic world subject to recurring years of serious depression. If it should be characteristic of business in general to experience 8 prosperous or average years followed by 2 unprofitable ones, The effect of these rules would be to encourage investment in bonds at high prices during good times and to impel their sale at low prices during depressions. In our view, the only practical rigid application of a minimum earnings standard must be to the average results over a period of time. A 5-year average, as prescribed by the statute in the case of public utility bonds, would seem too short under many circumstances, and we should suggest a 7-year period as a more suitable normal standard. But this might be shortened somewhat to exclude clearly abnormal years. For example, the 6-year period 1934 to 1939 would probably provide a fairer test period than the 7-year period 1933 to 1939. If the test had been made, say, in 1934 or 1935, it would have been better to use a 10 or even 12-year period to avoid giving undue weight to years of severe depression. Practical considerations suggest also that averaging in the large deficits experienced by some industrial companies during 1931 to 1933 might produce an earnings coverage figure too low to be fairly representative of the current situation, even though a long-term average were taken. This difficulty may be solved arbitrarily by considering the earnings in deficit years as zero instead of the actual negative figure. Other phases of the earnings record. There are, of course, a number of other aspects of the earnings picture to which the investor would do well to pay attention. Among these are the trend, the minimum figure, and the current figure. The importance of each of these cannot be gainsaid, but they do not lend themselves effectively to the application of hard and fast rules. In this case, as in the matter of mortgage security previously discussed, a distinction must be drawn between the few factors which can successfully be embraced by definite and universally applicable rules, and the many other factors which resist such exact formulation but must nevertheless be taken into account by the judgment of the investor. Unfavorable factors may be offset. The practical method of dealing with elements of the latter type may be illustrated in this matter of the earning exhibit. The investor must demand an average at least equal to the minimum standard. In addition, he will be attracted by A. a rising trend of profits, B. an especially good current showing, and C. a satisfactory margin over interest charges in every year during the period studied. If a bond is deficient in any one of these three aspects, the result should not necessarily be to condemn the issue, but rather to exact an average earnings coverage well in excess of the minimum and to require closer attention to the general or qualitative elements in the situation. If the trend has been unfavorable or the latest figure alone has been decidedly poor, the investor should certainly not accept the bond unless the average earnings have been substantially above the minimum requirement, and unless also he has reasonable grounds for believing that the downward trend or the current slump is not likely to continue indefinitely. Needless to say, the amount by which the average must be advanced in order to offset an unfavorable trend or current exhibit is a matter within the discretion of the investor to determine, and cannot be developed into any set of mathematical formulas. The relation of the coupon rate to the earnings coverage. The theory of earnings coverage is complicated by the arithmetical fact that this coverage varies inversely with the rate of interest. Given the same earnings, interest on a 3% bond issue would be earned twice as many times as it would be if the rate were 6%. Consider the following comparison. Utility Company A, earnings for interest $600,000. Utility Company B, $600,000. Interest charges, Utility Company A, 3% on $10 million, $300,000. Utility Company B, 5.5% on $10 million, $550,000. Times interest earned, Utility Company A, 2.00, Utility Company B, 1.09. The difference in coupon rates alone makes Company A pass our earnings coverage test, whereas Company B barely earns its interest. This point may well raise several questions, viz. 1. Can a bond be considered safe merely because it carries a low coupon rate? 2. What would be the effect on this safety of a rise in the general rate of interest? 3. Are the bonds of Company A a sounder purchase for investment than those of Company B? Let us attempt to answer these questions briefly in their order. 1. Effective coupon rate on safety. Safety, in the technical sense of assurance of continued payment of interest, can certainly be created or destroyed by varying the coupon rate. It is not feasible to think of a 5.5% bond as being safe as to 3% interest and unsafe as to the additional 2.5%. Safety of interest is an indivisible concept and must apply to the entire interest charge. The reason being that inability to pay part of the contractual interest or even junior interest will result in financial difficulties. These in turn mean the destruction, at least temporarily, of the investment status. Safety in the sense of maintenance of principal value can also be created by a low rate of interest, provided this rate is considered to be permanent, that is, lasting either through maturity or for a great many years in the future. If the 3% rate is permanent, the earnings of $600,000 should enable Company A to refund its bonds at maturity, and they should also maintain the market price of the bonds not far from par. Allowance must be made for the fact that the rate of interest tends to vary inversely with the ability of the company to pay it. A strong company borrows at a low rate, although it could afford to pay more than could a weak company. This means that good credit itself produces better credit through its own saving and interest charges, whereas the opposite is equally true. Although this may seem paradoxical and unfair, it must be accepted as a fact in security analysis. 2. Effect of a rise in interest rates on safety. A general rise in interest rates would not affect the ability of a company to meet its interest charges during the life of its low-rate bond issue. But if they mature in a short time, it will be faced with the problem of refunding at a higher rate, to effect which its earnings must show an adequate margin above this higher rate. On the other hand, if the maturity is distant, the market price of this and other bonds will decline substantially should the general rate of interest experience a considerable rise. Note that the Dow Jones Index of bond prices declined about 30% between 1917 and 1920, reflecting a rise in interest rates. It follows, therefore, that safety of principal, in the sense of maintenance of market value, is certain to be affected adversely in the case of long-term bonds by a sharp rise in the rate of interest. Safety of principal of short-term debt may be affected adversely by such a rise in interest rates if the earnings coverage does not exceed our minimum by a comfortable margin. The practical conclusion must be that if the investor considers a rise in interest rates probable, he should not buy long-term low-coupon bonds, no matter how strong the company, and he should buy short-term issues only if earnings would cover a higher coupon rate with an adequate margin. If, however, he is convinced that the low interest rates are here to stay, he may accept them in the same way as the higher rates were formerly accepted. If he is undecided as to the future of interest rates, the best policy might seem to be to confine purchases of bonds to fairly short maturity, say not longer than 10 years, and also to increase his earnings coverage requirement to offset the low coupon rate. 3. Relative attractiveness of the two bonds. Our third question relates to the comparative attractiveness of the 3% bonds of Company A and the 5.5% bonds of Company B. In strict logic, the 5.5% bond must certainly be more desirable than the 3% bond, since the 5.5% bondholder could always place his claim to the extra 2.5% on a contingent basis and thus make his company's margin above fixed charges the same as Company A's. But in practice, such a reduction of fixed interest is likely to be made only after the issuer has fallen into financial difficulties, which in turn would cause a substantial decline in the market price of the issue. Hence, as a practical matter, it is possible that the holder of the 3% bond may fare better than the owner of the 5.5% bond. However, the anomaly evident in our example should carry a warning to the investor not to pay about par for a 3% bond on the showing of Company A unless he is absolutely convinced of the permanence of very low interest rates. It will also indicate that there are certain speculative opportunities inherent in a bond of the Company B type if it is selling at a very low price because of the small margin above its high interest charges, especially if continuance of low interest rates is expected. Chapter 10. Specific Standards for Bond Investment continued. The relation of the value of the property to the funded debt. In our earlier discussion, Chapter 6, we pointed out that the soundness of the typical bond investment depends upon the ability of the obligor corporation to take care of its debts, rather than upon the value of the property on which the bonds have a lien. This broad principle naturally leads directly away from the establishment of any general tests of bond safety based upon the value of the mortgaged assets, where this value is considered apart from the success or failure of the enterprise itself. Stating the matter differently, we do not believe that in the case of the ordinary corporation bond, whether railroad, utility, or industrial, it would be advantageous to stipulate any minimum relationship between the value of the physical property pledged, taken at either original or reproduction cost, and the amount of the debt. In this respect, we are in disagreement with statutory provisions in many states, including New York, which reflect the traditional emphasis upon property values. The New York law, for example, will not admit as eligible a gas, electric, or telephone bond unless it is secured by property having a value 66 2/3% in excess of the bond issue. This value is presumably book value, which either may be the original dollar cost less depreciation, or may be some more or less artificial value set up as a result of transfer or reappraisal. Special types of obligations. 1. Equipment obligations. It is our view that the book value of public utility properties and of railroads and the typical industrial plant as well is no guidance in determining the safety of the bond issues secured thereon. There are, however, various special types of obligations, the safety of which is in great measure dependent upon the assets securing them, as distinguished from the going concern value of the enterprise as a whole. The most characteristic of these, perhaps, is the Railroad Equipment Trust Certificate, secured by title to locomotives, freight cars, or passenger cars, and by the pledge of the lease under which the railroad is using the equipment. The investment record of these equipment obligations is very satisfactory, particularly because until recently even the most serious financial difficulties of the issuing road have very rarely prevented the prompt payment of interest and principal. The primary reason for these good results is that the specific property pledged is removable and usable by other carriers. Consequently, it enjoys an independent saleable value similar to automobiles, jewelry, and other chattels on which personal loans are made. Even where there might be great difficulty in actually selling the rolling stock to some other railroad at a reasonable price, this mobility still gives the equipment obligation a great advantage over the mortgages on the railroad itself. Both kinds of property are essential to the operation of the line, but the railroad bondholder has no alternative save to permit the receiver to operate his property, while the holder of the equipment lien can at least threaten to take the rolling stock away. It is the possession of this alternative which in practice has proved of prime value to the owner of equipment trusts, because it has virtually compelled the holders even of the first mortgages on the road itself to subordinate their claim to his. It follows that the holder of the equipment trust certificates has two separate sources of protection, the one being the credit and success of the borrowing railway, the other being the value of the pledged rolling stock. If the latter value is sufficiently in excess of the money loaned against it, he may be able to ignore the first or credit factor entirely, in the same way as a pawnbroker ignores the financial status of the individual to whom he lends money and is content to rely exclusively on the pledged property. The conditions under which equipment trusts are usually created supply a substantial degree of protection to the purchaser. The legal forms are designed to facilitate the enforcement of the lien holder's rights in the event of non-payment. In practically all cases, at least 20% of the cost of the equipment is provided by the railway, and consequently the amount of the equipment obligations is initially not more than 80% of the value of the property pledged behind them. The principal is usually repayable in 15 equal annual installments, beginning 1 year from issuance, so that the amount of the debt is reduced more rapidly than ordinary depreciation would require. The protection accorded the equipment trust holder by these arrangements has been somewhat diminished in recent years, due partly to the drop in commodity prices, which has brought reproduction and therefore saleable values far below original cost, and also to the reduced demand for equipment, whether new or used, because of the smaller traffic handled. Since 1930, certain railroads in receivership, for example Seaboard, Airline, and Wabash, have required holders of maturing equipment obligations to extend their maturities for a short period or to exchange them for trustees or receivers' certificates carrying a lower coupon. In the unique case of one Florida East Coast Railway issue, Series D, the receivers permitted the equipment trust holders to take over and sell the pledged equipment, which seemed to have been less valuable than that securing other series. In this instance, the holders realized only 43 cents on the dollar from the sale and have a deficiency judgment of doubtful value against the road for the balance. These maneuvers and losses suggest that the claim of almost absolute safety, frequently made in behalf of equipment issues, will have to be moderated, but it cannot be denied that this form of investment enjoys a positive and substantial advantage through the realizability of the pledged assets. This conclusion may be supported by a concrete reference to the sale in November 1939 of Chicago and Northwestern New Equipment Trust 2.5s, due 1940 to 1949, at prices to yield only from 0.45 to 2.35%, despite the fact that all the mortgage issues of that road were then in default. 2. Collateral trust bonds. Collateral trust bonds are obligations secured by the pledge of stocks or other bonds. In the typical case, the collateral consists of bonds of the obligor company itself or of the bonds or stocks of subsidiary corporations. Consequently, the realizable value of the collateral is usually dependent in great measure on the success of the enterprise as a whole. But in the case of the collateral trust issues of investment companies, a development of recent years, the holder may be said to have a primary interest in the market value of the pledged securities, so that it is quite possible that by virtue of the protective conditions in the indenture, he may be completely taken care of under conditions which mean virtual extinction for the stockholders. This type of collateral trust bond may therefore be ranked with equipment trust obligations as exceptions to our general rule that the bond buyer must place his chief reliance on the success of the enterprise and not on the property specifically pledged. Going behind the form to the substance, we may point out that this characteristic is essentially true also of investment trust debenture obligations, for it makes little practical difference whether the portfolio is physically pledged with a trustee, as under a collateral trust indenture, or whether it is held by the corporation subject to the claim of the debenture bondholders. In the usual case, the debentures are protected by adequate provisions against increasing the debt, and frequently also by a covenant requiring the market price of the company's assets to be maintained at a stated percentage above the face amount of the bonds. Example: the Reliance Management Corporation Debenture 5s, due 1954, are an instance of the working of these protective provisions. The enterprise as a whole was highly unsuccessful, as is shown vividly by a decline in the price of the stock from 69 in in 1929 to 1 in 1933. In the case of the ordinary bond issue, such a collapse in the stock value would have meant almost certain default and large loss of principal. But here, the fact that the assets could be readily turned into cash gave significance to the protective covenants behind the debentures. It made possible and compelled the repurchase by the company of more than 3/4 of the issue, and it even forced the stockholders to contribute additional capital to make good a deficiency of assets below the indenture requirements. This resulted in the bonds selling as high as 88 in 1932, when the stock sold for only 2.5. The balance of the issue was called at 104.25 in February 1937. In Chapter 18, devoted to protective covenants, we shall refer to the history of a collateral trust bond issue of an investment company, financial investing company, and we shall point out that the intrinsic strength of such obligations is often impaired, unnecessarily, in our opinion, by hesitation in asserting the bondholder's rights. 3. Real estate bonds. Of much greater importance than either of the two types of securities just discussed is the large field of real estate mortgages and real estate mortgage bonds. The latter represent participations of convenient size in large individual mortgages. There is no doubt that in the case of such obligations, the value of the pledged land and buildings is of paramount importance. The ordinary real estate loan made by an experienced investor is based chiefly upon his conclusions as to the fair value of the property offered as security. It seems to us, however, that in a broad sense the values behind real estate mortgages are going concern values. That is, they are derived fundamentally from the earning power of the property, either actual or presumptive. In other words, the value of the pledged asset is not something distinct from the success of the enterprise, as is possibly the case with a railroad equipment trust certificate, but is rather identical therewith. This point may be made clearer by a reference to the most typical form of real estate loan, a first mortgage on a single-family dwelling house. Under ordinary conditions, a home costing $10,000 would have a rental value, or an equivalent value to an owner-tenant, of some $1,200 per year, and would yield a net income of about $800 after taxes and other expenses. A 5% first mortgage loan on the savings bank basis, that is, 60% of value or $6,000, would therefore be protected by a normal earning power of over twice the interest requirements. Stated differently, the rental value could suffer a reduction of over 1/3 before the ability to meet interest charges would be impaired. Hence, the mortgagee reasons that regardless of the ability of the then owner of the house to pay the carrying charges, he could always find a tenant or a new purchaser who would rent or buy the property on a basis at least sufficient to cover his 60% loan. By way of contrast, it may be pointed out that a typical industrial plant costing $1 million and bonded for $600,000 could not be expected to sell or rent for enough to cover the 5% mortgage if the issuing company went into bankruptcy. Property values and earning power closely related. This illustration shows that under normal conditions obtaining in the field of dwellings, offices, and stores, the property values and the rental values go hand in hand. In this sense, it is largely immaterial whether the lender views mortgaged property of this kind as something with saleable value or as something with an earning power, the equivalent of a going concern. To some extent, this is true also of vacant lots and unoccupied houses or stores, since the market value of these is closely related to the expected rental when improved or let. It is emphatically not true, however, of buildings erected for a special purpose, such as factories, etc. Misleading character of appraisals. The foregoing discussion is important in its bearing on the correct attitude that the intending investor in real estate bonds should take towards the property values asserted to exist behind the issues submitted to him. During the great and disastrous development of the real estate mortgage bond business between 1923 and 1929, The only datum customarily presented to support the usual bond offering, aside from an estimate of future earnings, was a statement of the appraised value of the property, which almost invariably amounted to some 66 2/3% in excess of the mortgage issue. If these appraisals had corresponded to the market values which experienced buyers of or lenders on real estate would place upon the properties, they would have been of real utility in the selection of sound real estate bonds. But unfortunately, they were purely artificial valuations, to which the appraisers were willing to attach their names for a fee, and whose only function was to deceive the investor as to the protection which he was receiving. The method followed by these appraisals was the capitalization on a liberal basis of the rental expected to be returned by the property. By this means, a typical building which cost $1 million, including liberal financing charges, would immediately be given an appraised value of $1,500,000. Hence, a bond issue could be floated for almost the entire cost of the venture, so that the builders or promoters retained the equity, that is, the ownership of the building, without a cent's investment, and in many cases with a goodly cash profit to boot. This whole scheme of real estate financing was honeycombed with the most glaring weaknesses, and it is sad commentary on the lack of principle, penetration, and ordinary common sense on the part of all parties concerned that it was permitted to reach such gigantic proportions before the inevitable collapse. Abnormal rentals used as a basis of valuation. It was indeed true that the scale of rentals prevalent in 1928 to 1929 would yield an abundantly high rate of income on the cost of a new real estate venture. But this condition could not properly be interpreted as making a new building immediately worth 50% in excess of its actual cost. For this high income return was certain to be only temporary, since it could not fail to stimulate more and more building until an oversupply of space caused a collapse in the scale of rentals. This overbuilding was the more inevitable because it was possible to carry it on without risk on the part of the owner, who raised all the money needed from the public. Debt based on excessive construction costs. A collateral result of this overbuilding was an increase in the cost of construction to abnormally high levels. Hence, even an apparently conservative loan made in 1928 or 1929 in an amount not exceeding 2/3 of actual cost did not enjoy a proper degree of protection, because there was the evident danger, subsequently realized, that a sharp drop in construction costs would reduce fundamental values to a figure below the amount of the loan. Weakness of specialized buildings. A third general weakness of real estate bond investment lay in the entire lack of discrimination as between various types of building projects. The typical or standard real estate loan was formerly made on a home, and its peculiar virtue lay in the fact that there was an indefinitely large number of prospective purchasers or tenants to draw upon, so that it could always be disposed of at some moderate concession from the current scale of values. A fairly similar situation is normally presented by the ordinary apartment house or store or office building. But when a structure is built for some special purpose, such as a hotel, garage, club, hospital, church, or factory, it loses this quality of rapid disposability, and its value becomes bound up with the success of the particular enterprise for whose use it was originally intended. Hence, mortgage bonds on such structures are not actually real estate bonds in the accepted sense, but rather loans extended to a business, and consequently their safety must be judged by all the stringent tests surrounding the purchase of an industrial obligation. This point was completely lost sight of in the rush of real estate financing preceding the collapse in real estate values. Bonds were floated to build hotels, garages, and even hospitals on very much the same basis as loans made on apartment houses. In other words, an appraisal showing a value of 1/2 to 2/3 in excess of the bond issue was considered almost enough to establish the safety of the loan. It turned out, however, that when such new ventures proved commercially unsuccessful and were unable to pay their interest charges, the real estate bondholders were in little better position than the holders of a mortgage on an unprofitable railroad or mill property. Values based on initial rentals misleading. Another weakness should be pointed out in connection with apartment house financing. The rental income used in determining the appraised value was based on the rentals to be charged at the outset. But apartment house tenants are accustomed to pay a substantial premium for space in a new building, and they consider a structure old or at least no longer especially modern and desirable after it has been standing a very few years. Consequently, under normal conditions, the rentals received in the first years are substantially larger than those which can conservatively be expected throughout the life of the bond issue. Lack of financial information. A defect related to those discussed above, but of a different character, was the almost universal failure to supply the bond buyer with operating and financial data after his purchase. This drawback applies generally to companies that sell bonds to the public, but whose stock is privately held, an arrangement characteristic of real estate financing. As a result, not only were most bondholders unaware of the poor showing of the venture until default had actually taken place, but, more serious still, at that time they frequently found that large unpaid taxes had accrued against the property while the owners were milking it by drawing down all available cash. Suggested rules of procedure. From this detailed analysis of the defects of real estate bond financing in the past decade, a number of specific rules of procedure may be developed to guide the investor in the future. In the case of single-family dwellings, loans are generally made directly by the mortgage holder to the owner of the home, that is, without the intermediary of a real estate mortgage bond sold by a house of issue. But an extensive business has also been transacted by mortgage companies, for example, Lawyers Mortgage Company, Title Guarantee and Trust Company, in guaranteed mortgages and mortgage participation certificates secured on such dwellings. Where investments of this kind are made, the lender should be certain, A, that the amount of the loan is not over 66 2/3% of the value of the property, as shown either by actual recent cost or by the amount which an experienced real estate man would consider a fair price to pay for the property, and B, that this cost or fair price does not reflect recent speculative inflation and does not greatly exceed the price levels existing for a long period previously. If so, a proper reduction must be made in the maximum relation of the amount of mortgage debt to the current value. The more usual real estate mortgage bond represents a participation in a first mortgage on a new apartment house or office building. In considering such offerings, the investor should ignore the conventional appraised values submitted and demand that the actual cost, fairly presented, should exceed the amount of the bond issue by at least 50%. Secondly, he should require an estimated income account conservatively calculated to reflect losses through vacancies and the decline in the rental scale as the building grows older. This income account should forecast a margin of at least 100% over interest charges after deducting from earnings a depreciation allowance to be actually expended as a sinking fund for the gradual retirement of the bond issue. The borrower should agree to supply the bondholders with regular operating and financial statements. Issues termed first leasehold mortgage bonds are in actuality second mortgages. They are issued against buildings erected on leased land, and the ground rent operates in effect as a first lien or prior charge against the entire property. In analyzing such issues, the ground rent should be added to the bond interest requirements to arrive at the total interest charges of the property. Furthermore, it should be recognized that in the field of real estate obligations, the advantage of a first mortgage over a junior lien is much more clean-cut than in an ordinary business enterprise. In addition to the above quantitative tests, the investor should be satisfied in his own mind that the location and type of the building are such as to attract tenants and to minimize the possibility of a large loss of value through unfavorable changes in the character of the neighborhood. Real estate loans should not be made on buildings erected for a special or limited purpose, such as hotels, garages, etc. Commitments of this kind must be made in the venture itself, considered as an individual business. From our previous discussion of the standards applicable to a high-grade industrial bond purchase, it is difficult to see how any bond issue on a new hotel or the like could logically be bought on a straight investment basis. All such enterprises should be financed at the outset by private capital, and only after they can show a number of years of successful operation should the public be offered either bonds or stock therein. Chapter 11. Specific Standards for Bond Investment. Concluded. Relation of stock capitalization to bonded debt. The amount of stock and surplus following or junior to a bond issue expresses the same fact as the excess of resources over indebtedness. This can be seen at once from the following condensed typical balance sheet. Assets less current liabilities, net assets, $1 million. Bonded debt, $600,000. Stock and surplus, stock equity, $400,000. The resultant simple formula is as follows. Stock equity divided by bonded debt equals net assets divided by bonded debt minus 1. Standards prescribed by the New York law. If we are studying balance sheet figures, therefore, we can look either at the net assets or at the stock equity to determine the indicated coverage or margin above the principal amount of the debt. The New York statute governing investments of savings banks employs both approaches in its regulations respecting public utility bonds. It stipulates, 1, that the mortgage debt in question plus all underlying mortgage debt shall not exceed 60% of the value of the mortgaged property, and 2, that the capital stock shall be equal to at least 2/3 of the mortgage debt. It will readily be observed from the typical balance sheet just given that these two requirements are broadly equivalent. Where a company has a substantial unsecured indebtedness, however, it might meet requirement 1 and not requirement 2, so that in such cases the second stipulation supplies an added protection. This point may be illustrated by the following example. Mortgaged property, $10 million, working capital, $1 million, total $11 million. Mortgage debt, $6 million, debentures, $3 million, stock and surplus, $2 million, total $11 million. In this case, the mortgage debt is only 60% of the pledged property, but the stock equity is much less than 2/3 of the mortgage debt. Hence, the latter bonds would not be eligible. It should be noted that the New York statute considers only the par or stated value of the stock issues, including, of course, both preferred and common, and it does not give credit for the book surplus, which is part of the stockholder's equity. The theory behind this restriction may be that the surplus is legally distributable to the stockholders and cannot therefore be counted on as a permanent protection for the bondholders. In actuality, however, a utility company's surplus is almost invariably invested to a large extent in fixed assets and is not distributable in cash. Hence, if tests of this kind are to be required, the stock and surplus figure would appear more logical than the stock issue alone. Equity test of doubtful merit in the case of utilities. We are inclined to question whether any substantial advantage is gained in the ordinary case by applying the property or stock issue test to public utility bonds. It is unlikely to give any indication of safety or lack of safety not already shown by the earnings record. In some few instances, perhaps the income exhibit may be satisfactory, but the asset coverage unduly small, and the latter point may suggest that since the company is earning an exceptionally high rate on its investment, it is vulnerable to unfavorable rate regulation. The primary difficulty, however, has lain in the lack of dependability of the balance sheet figures of property values, and hence of stock equity, as an indication either of the actual cash investment or of the reproduction value, which may be designated as the rate base. But in recent years, the activities of the state commissions and the SEC have given the public far more accurate balance sheets than formerly. Even allowing for this improvement, there does not seem to be sufficient reason to exact a property value or stock equity test for public utility bonds and none for railroad bonds. There is, of course, no objection to the application of this stock equity test based on book figures to both railroad and public utility obligations as an added precaution, either regularly or in special cases where there is reason to doubt the reliability of the earnings record as a measure of the future ability to meet bond interest. If this test is applied, it should be pointed out that a maximum ratio of 60% of debt to 40% of stock and surplus is proportionately more severe than a minimum earnings ratio of 1 3/4 times interest charges. It would be more consistent, therefore, to admit a bonded debt as high as 75% of the property value, or 3 times the amount of the stock and surplus. Importance of a real value coverage behind a bond issue. Our principal objection to the property value criterion arises from the undoubted fact that the book valuations of fixed assets are highly unreliable as indications of the safety of a bond. But on the other hand, we are convinced that a substantial margin of going concern value over funded debt is not only important, but even vitally necessary to assure the soundness of a fixed value investment. Before paying standard prices for bonds of any enterprise, whether it be a railroad, a telephone company, or a department store, the investor must be convinced that the business is worth a great deal more than it owes. In this respect, the bond buyer must take the same attitude as the lender of money on a house or a diamond ring, with the important difference that it is the value of the business as an entity which the investor must usually consider, and not that of the separate assets. Going concern value and earning power. The value of the business as an entity is most often entirely determined by its earning power. This explains the overshadowing significance that has come to be attached to the income exhibit, for the latter reveals not only the ability of the company to meet its interest charges, but also the extent to which the going value of the business may be said to exceed the principal of the bond issue. It is for this reason that most investors have come to regard the earnings record as the only statistical or quantitative test necessary in the selection of bond issues. All other criteria commonly employed are either qualitative or subjective, that is, involving personal views as to the management, prospects, etc. While it is desirable to make the tests of safe bonds as simple and as few as possible, their reduction to the single criterion of the margin of earnings over interest charges would seem to be a dangerous oversimplification of the problem. The earnings during the period examined may be non-representative either because they resulted from definitely temporary conditions, favorable or the reverse, or because they were presented in such a way as not to reflect the true income. These conditions are particularly likely to occur in the case of industrial companies, which are subject both to greater individual vicissitudes and to a smaller degree of accounting supervision than is true of railroads and utilities. Shareholders' equity measured by market value of stock issues, a supplemental test. We feel, therefore, that it is essential, in the case of industrial bonds at least, to supplement the earnings test by some other quantitative index of the margin of going concern value above the funded debt. The best criterion that we are able to offer for this purpose is the ratio of the market value of the capital stock to the total funded debt. Strenuous objections may, of course, be leveled against using the market price of stock issues as a proof of anything in view of the extreme and senseless variations to which stock quotations are notoriously subject. Nevertheless, with all its imperfections, the market value of the stock issues is generally recognized as a better index of the fair going value of a business than is afforded by the balance sheet figures or even the ordinary appraisal. Note carefully that we are proposing the use of stock prices for the restricted purpose only of ascertaining whether or not a substantial equity exists behind the bond issue. This is by no means tantamount to stating that the price is always an exact measure of the fair or intrinsic value. The market price test is suggested as a rough index or clue to the existing values, and it is to be employed only as a supplement, but an important supplement to the more carefully scrutinized figures supplied by the earnings record. The utility of the market price test in extreme cases is unquestionable. The presence of a stock equity with market value many times as large as the total debt carries a strong assurance of the safety of the bond issue, and, conversely, an exceedingly small stock equity at market prices must call the soundness of the bond into serious question. The determination of the market value of the stock equity and its comparison with the total amount of funded debt is a well-established feature of bond analysis, and it was formally included in bond offering circulars when the showing made was satisfactory. We recommend that this calculation be made a standard element in the procedure of bond selection, especially for industrial issues, and that minimum requirements under this heading be set up which will serve as a secondary quantitative test of safety. Minima for the stock equity test. What should be the normal minimum relationship between stock values and funded debt? It is difficult to answer this question satisfactorily from actual experience because of the wide changes in stock prices and the variations in the exhibits of individual companies. A theoretical rule can be established by assuming, somewhat arbitrarily, that railroad and utility stocks should earn about 1.5 times as large a percentage on their price as the interest rate on their bonds, whereas industrial stocks should earn twice as much as the interest rate on their bonds. These assumptions would produce the following arithmetical relationship between the minimum interest coverage on the one hand and the stock-to-bond ratio on the other. See accompanying PDF for these charts. Income bonds equivalent to stock equity. In Chapter 9, we pointed out that since interest on income bonds is not a fixed charge, it need not be included in the total charges on which coverage is to be calculated. Similarly, the principal amount of such bonds is not to be included in the total funded debt that is to be compared with the stock equity. Not only is this so, but it is true also that junior income bonds of long maturity are so close in their character to preferred stock that their market value may properly be considered as part of the stock equity, or rather income bond and stock equity, junior to and protecting the fixed interest bonds. In the case of the Colorado Fuel and Iron General First Fives due 1943, found in the accompanying PDF, the technical position of the first mortgage fives is entirely different by virtue of the fact that the junior lien is an income bond than it would be if the latter carried fixed interest. That this is true is shown in striking fashion by reference to the situation prior to the reorganization of 1930. In the former setup, the first fives were followed by a large fixed interest bond issue, the requirements of which, including their maturity, precipitated a receivership in 1933, following which the first fives sold as low as 30. Significance of unusually large stock value ratio. As we have previously intimated, if the stock value ratio were always proportionate to the interest coverage, in the manner suggested in the foregoing table, there would be no reason to apply both tests, since the passing of one would assure passing of the other. Such is not the case, however, and we must accordingly consider what is implied when the stock value ratio gives a substantially different indication from that given by the interest coverage. Let us assume first that the earnings picture is not completely convincing, but that the stock value ratio is considerably higher than our minimum requirement. Example. Referring to the Fairbanks-Morse example on page 130, the investor would be impressed by the fact that at the lowest market price in 1938, the stock equity ratio was more than 2 to 1. About $12 million market value of stock behind $5,600,000 of bonds. This evidence of strength might well dispel any doubt arising from the inadequacy of the straight 10-year average. Significance of a subnormal stock value ratio. The opposite case is that in which the interest coverage may be called satisfactory, but the stock value ratio is substantially below the minimum required. Examples. The problem here may be better understood by the use of two contrasting examples, one taken in the midst of depression and the other at the peak of recovery. The first is that of Inland Steel 4.5s, due 1978, which sold in September 1932 at 82 to yield 5.6%. The relevant data may be found in the accompanying PDF, together with corresponding figures for Crucible Steel 5s due 1940, which are supplied for comparison. It will be seen that the Inland Steel issue met our earnings test based on a 6.5-year average, but failed to meet our stock ratio test. Most investors would reason that the bond was a very sound and attractive investment at the time because 1. Inland Steel was one of the best steel companies with a fine pre-depression record, and 2. The 1932 figures, both for earnings and for stock prices, were so abnormal as to afford no guide to the safety of the bond issue. The fact that the company's earnings recovered later on and that the bonds were called at a premium in 1936 would be pointed to as confirming the soundness of this view. But the weakness of the reasoning lies in the fact that it required certain assumptions as to the future which should not be needed to justify the purchase of an investment bond. Note that under the conditions of 1932, the price of 82 for Inland Steel 4.5s put them distinctly in the investment class. This should be clear if we compare the exhibits of the Inland and Crucible issues. It will be seen that both the earnings coverage and the stock value ratio were better for the Crucible issue, yet the yield on the latter was twice as high as for the Inland bond. The purchaser of the Inland Steel 4.5s would have to assume not only that the 1932 conditions were transitory, a necessary assumption if there was to be any buying of securities, but also 1. That the price of Inland Steel stock was much too low, and 2. That the price of Crucible Steel stock issues was much too high. For unless the Inland stock was selling too low, the Inland bonds could not be considered safe. And unless the Crucible shares were selling too high, he would have been much better advised to buy the lower-priced Crucible bonds. This would seem to be entirely too complicated and doubtful a basis for a straight bond investment. It is true also as a general rule that no bond investment should be made if it requires the assumption that the common stock is selling too low at the time. If the investor is right in that judgment of the stock value, it would certainly be more profitable to buy the stock than the bonds. If he is wrong as to the stock value, he runs great risk of having made a poor bond purchase. The fact that the Inland Steel bonds were later repaid at an advance of some 20 points does not invalidate our logic, but rather confirms it. For by the same time, Inland Common had advanced over fourfold in value, and the Crucible Steel 5s had risen from 60 to 102. We advert once more to our controlling principle that bond investment is a negative art. This discussion was not intended to imply that the Inland Steel 4.5s were a poor investment. The contrary is clearly the case, but we wished to point out that a logical examination of the picture at the time would not have led to an affirmative verdict for that issue, particularly in view of the alternative investments offered. A second example. We may buttress our argument further by introducing an opposite type of illustration. The Brooklyn Manhattan Transit 4.5s, due 1966, which sold at 104 to yield 4.27% in January 1937. The average earnings coverage here was about adequate, judged by our minimum standard for railroad bonds. However, the stock value ratio, even at the high general market level then obtaining, showed less than 40 cents of stock for each dollar of bonds. This meant, in essence, that the stock market was not sufficiently optimistic as to the prospects of the BMT to value the equity issues at our minimum requirement in relation to total debt. The bond buyer would have been well advised to take this deficiency in the secondary test as a hint to look elsewhere for its 4.5% investments. By December of that same year, the bonds had fallen to 44. Our reference to the stock market's valuation of future prospects of Brooklyn-Manhattan Transit suggests that the stock equity test is not merely an additional quantitative criterion of bond safety, but that it is in good part a qualitative index as well. A third function of the stock value test may be to throw justifiable doubt on the complete accuracy of the reported earnings figures. In the case of BMT, a careful study of the offering prospectus would have revealed a wide difference between depreciation and amortization charges as shown on the reports to security holders and as taken on the income tax returns. The more conservative depreciation basis would have reduced the interest coverage to well below our suggested minimum. Stock value ratio for railroad and public utility companies. In the case of industrial companies, the stock value ratio may be easily calculated. Railroads and public utilities, however, are likely to present various complications. In addition to the bonded debt as shown in the balance sheet, it may also be necessary to consider rental obligations equivalent to debt and preferred stocks of subsidiaries ranking ahead of parent company bonds. These difficulties militate somewhat against the use of the stock value ratio test for railroad and utility bonds. However, we believe that a careful investor should apply the stock value test in these fields as well as to industrials. As we shall point out in the next chapter, the stock value test would have been of great utility in guarding against the mistaken purchase of many railroad bonds at high prices during 1935 to 1937. In the next chapter also, we shall describe the procedure of capitalizing the fixed charges to arrive at a fair estimate of total debt when the balance sheet may not tell the whole story. Stock value test not to be modified to reflect changing market conditions. The question arises, to what extent should the stock value ratio test be modified to reflect changing market conditions? It would seem proper to expect, and therefore to demand, a higher relative market value for the stock behind a bond issue when times are good than during a depression. If $1 of stock to $1 of bonds is taken as the normal requirement for an industrial company, would it not be sound to demand, say, a $2 to $1 ratio when stock prices are inflated, and conversely to be satisfied with a 50-cent to $1 ratio when quotations are far below intrinsic values? But this suggestion is impracticable for two reasons. The first being that it implies that the bond buyer can recognize an unduly high or low level of stock prices, which is far too complimentary an assumption. The second is that it would require bond investors to act with a special caution when things are booming and with greater confidence when times are hard. This is a counsel of perfection which it is not in human nature to follow. Bond buyers are people, and they cannot be expected to escape entirely either the enthusiasm of bull markets or the apprehensions of a severe depression. We should not propose a rule, therefore, by which investors are to require a larger than usual stock value ratio when prices are high, for such advice will not be followed. But if the bond buyer is personally convinced that stock prices are dangerously high, he would be wise to insist on a stock equity coverage well above our minimum ratios. Nor shall we propose the opposite rule for bear markets, particularly because by diligent search, it will always be possible to find some investments that meet all the normal tests even under depressed conditions. Chapter 12. Special Factors in the Analysis of Railroad and Public Utility Bonds. Railroad Bond Analysis. The selection of railroad bonds can be made a process of extreme complexity. The reports of the carriers to the Interstate Commerce Commission contain voluminous data on the financial and physical condition of the railroads, which supply material for elaborate analysis. A really thorough study of a railway report would devote attention to the following items, among others. 1. Financial. A. Composition and trend of operating revenue. B. Ratio of maintenance expenditures to gross. C. Relative amount and trend of transportation expenses. D. Character of other income. E. Coverage for and relative growth of interest and other deductions. 2. Physical. A. Location. B. Amount of double and third track. C. Weight of rail. D. Character of ballast. E. Amount and capacity of equipment owned. 3. Operating. A. Character and density of traffic. B. Average haul and average rate received. C. Train load. D. Fuel costs. E. Train and car mile operating costs. F. Maintenance charges per unit of equipment. In addition to the above items affecting the railroad as a whole, a special study can be made of the mileage covered by the mortgage lien under consideration. Elaborate technique of analysis not necessary for selection of high-grade bonds. Comprehensive analyses of this kind are actually made by the investment departments of large financial institutions which purchase railroad bonds. They are, however, not only clearly beyond the competence of the individual investor, but in our opinion, they are hardly consistent with the true nature of high-grade bond investment. The selection of a fixed value security for limited income return should be, relatively at least, a simple operation. The investor must make certain by quantitative tests that the income has been amply above the interest charges and that the current value of the business is well in excess of its debts. In addition, he must be satisfied in his own judgment that the character of the enterprise is such as to promise continued success in the future, or more accurately speaking, to make failure a highly unlikely occurrence. These tests and this expression of judgment should not require a highly elaborate technique of analysis. If the investor in railroad bonds must weigh such factors as a favorable train load trend as against a poor diversification of traffic handled, he is called upon to exercise penetration and skill out of all proportion to the reward offered, viz., a fixed income return of from 2 3/4 to 4.5%. He would certainly be better advised to buy United States government securities, which yield a lower return but are safe beyond question, or else to let one of the large savings banks invest his money for him with the aid of its extensive statistical staff. Recommended procedure. The complexities associated with railroad bond analysis have arisen naturally, but in our view rather illogically, from the wealth of data available for study. The fact that a mass of figures is obtainable does not mean that it is necessary or even advantageous to dissect them. We recommend that the buyer of high-grade railroad bonds confine his quantitative study to the coverage of fixed charges, with due attention to the trend of earnings and the adequacy of maintenance expenditures and to the amount of the stock equity. If he desires to be particularly careful, he will probably be better advised to increase his minimum requirements on these 2 points rather than to extend his statistical tests to numerous other features of the annual reports. It may make our viewpoint clearer if we add that such elaborate analyses may at times be of real value to the purchaser of speculative railroad bonds or stocks as aids to his judgment of what the future will bring. But the whole raison d'etre of fixed value investment is opposed to any primary reliance upon surmises as to the future, since the field for exercising such judgment must logically be among those issues which offer possibilities of gain as a reward for being right, commensurate with the penalties attached to being wrong. Technical aspects of railroad income analysis. The application of the interest coverage test to railroad bonds involves a few technical questions which require attention, Railways have various kinds of fixed charges which are obligations equivalent to bond interest and which clearly should be included with such interest in calculating the margin of safety. There are also certain deductions which partake to some extent of the nature of fixed charges and to some extent also of operating expenses. Furthermore, there are credits designated as other income, such as bond interest received, which may properly be considered as offsets to interest paid, at least for the purpose of comparison with other roads. In the following schedule, we allocate the more important items of this character that are encountered in railroad statements. 1. Bond interest and equivalent charges. A. Interest on funded and unfunded debt. B. Rent for leased lines. C. Joint facility rents. Net debit. 2. Deductions midway between fixed charges and operating expense. A. Hire of equipment. Net debit. B. Miscellaneous rents and miscellaneous deductions. 3. Credits that may be partially offset against bond interest in order of dependability. A. Bond interest received, rent for leased lines, joint facility rents, net credit. B. Hire of equipment, net credit, dividends received. C. Miscellaneous non-operating income. Methods of computing fixed charge coverage. Considerable argument might be indulged in as to the most scientific way of handling all these items in order to arrive at the best formulation of the fixed charges. The matter may be simplified, however, by bearing in mind that the bond buyer is not interested in exactitude, but rather in reasonable accuracy. After all, the data he is dealing with represent past history, the sole value of which is to serve as a hint or clue to the future. For such a purpose, refinement of calculation is of little benefit. We suggest that for railroad bonds, the necessities of the case with respect to interest coverage may be met by setting up a double test and requiring that the minimum margin be shown by each. The method proposed is as follows. Test A. Number of times fixed charges are earned. Fixed charges equal gross income minus net income, times fixed charges earned equals gross income divided by gross income minus net income. Note, gross income is the net after rents plus other income. Net income is the balance available for dividends. Test B, number of times net deductions are earned. Net deductions equals railway operating income minus net income, times net deductions earned equals railway operating income divided by railway operating income minus net income. Note, railway operating income is the same as a net after taxes, that is, the gross revenues minus operating expenses and taxes. It is necessary to apply only one of these two tests, viz., the more stringent one, which may readily be identified by inspection. The rule is as follows. If gross income exceeds net after taxes, apply the fixed charges test, test A. If net after taxes exceeds gross income, apply the net deductions test, test B. The application of these alternative tests will be clear from the examples as shown on page 161, which may be found in the accompanying PDF. Notes on the foregoing tests. 1. Chesapeake and Ohio represents the typical exhibit in which the results of both tests would have pointed to the same conclusion, in this case to the presence of a satisfactory margin of safety for the bonds. 2. In the case of Chicago Great Western, Test A, which is ordinarily applied, would not adequately reflect the burden of the unusually large rental deductions. Their effect is shown by Test B, and, in accordance with our suggestion, this less favorable result should be the one considered by the investor. 3. Northern Pacific presents the opposite situation. Its other income has been exceptionally large as compared with the bond interest, so that in most years the net deductions figure out as a credit. In this case, the investor should follow the results of Test A and consider Test B as a secondary indication of strength. The Pennsylvania Railroad's reports offer an exceptional case in that the larger part of its substantial other income is a direct offset against the fixed charges. These other income items consist of interest and guaranteed dividends received on securities of the system itself, which are owned by the parent company, so that the same items appear later as interest and rentals paid. In 1938, these offsetting amounts totaled some $30,298,074. They should properly be eliminated from the statement altogether. The effect of their inclusion was to reduce the indicated coverage under the fixed charges test, as can be found in the accompanying PDF. In this case, the net deductions test afforded a fairer criterion than the fixed charges test uncorrected. Where an especially careful analysis is to be made, the reported figures should be adjusted as above indicated on the basis of the available facts. Bearing of maintenance expenditures upon fixed charge coverage. There are two important items in railroad accounting which are subject in some degree to arbitrary determination by the management, and which may therefore be treated in any one year in such a manner as to produce deceptively favorable or unfavorable results. The first of these is the maintenance account. If unduly small amounts are spent on upkeep of road and equipment, the net profits are thereby increased at the expense of the property, and the balance reported as available for fixed charges does not fairly represent the earning power during the period under review. Bond buyers might do well to examine the maintenance ratio, that is, the percentage of gross revenues expended on upkeep of way and rolling stock, in order to make sure that it is not suspiciously below standard. Unfortunately, it is difficult to determine with any degree of assurance just what should be considered a standard maintenance rate for different groups of carriers. Prior to 1931, a figure of about 33% of gross operating revenues was so generally and consistently reported that it undoubtedly could be considered a norm, any wide deviation from which deserved special study. Since 1930, however, there has been a moderate decline in this percentage figure concurrently with a major shrinkage in the gross operating revenues against which it is computed. As a result, actual dollar expenditures for maintenance have been cut nearly in half. Somewhat surprisingly, the maintenance of way outlays in dollars, which presumably are not so subject to curtailment on account of smaller traffic, suffered a decline of 51% in 1933 to 1937 as against 1926 to 1930, whereas maintenance of equipment costs were reduced by 39%. On the other side must be set the undoubted improvement in the technology of maintenance as shown in the use of more efficient methods and more durable materials. The cost of maintaining a railroad property in adequate condition is now substantially less than it was prior to 1931, but how much less we cannot say with assurance. Hence, the difficulty of determining whether the average ratio of about 30.5% on the reduced gross of 1933 to 1937, shown by all Class I railroads, is sufficient to reassure the bond buyer against the existence of under-maintenance. Our judgment leans to the view that this figure is rather low, and that a somewhat higher ratio, say 32%, might better be taken as the investor's norm. If this suggestion is accepted, it would mean that when considering bonds of a railroad spending less than 32% of its gross on maintenance, the investor will either, 1. Make such further study as will convince him that the lower rate is adequate, or 2. Adjust the reported earnings to a hypothetical 32% ratio, thus reducing the earnings coverage correspondingly. If the coverage is satisfactory after this correction, it may be assumed that the possible under-maintenance is not in itself a serious enough factor to impair the safety of the bond. Non-recurring dividend receipts. A second item which sometimes repays scrutiny is that of dividends received. When a railroad controls subsidiary companies, it is possible to draw out accumulated profits at irregular intervals in the form of special dividends paid to the parent company. The effect of such transactions is to overstate the actual earning power of the parent company for the year in which the subsidiary's special dividend was received. Excessive maintenance and undistributed earnings of subsidiaries. Railroad reports will also disclose the opposite situation at times, viz., excessive maintenance expenditures or the existence of large current earnings of subsidiaries not paid over to the parent company. The effect of such accounting is to understate the true earning power of the carrier examined. Matters of this kind are of considerable interest in the analysis of stock values, but the bond buyer's concern with such factors is of secondary character. In general, he should not permit them to reverse an otherwise unfavorable verdict as to the safety of the bond, but he should recognize that their presence gives added attractiveness to bond issues which show adequate security without taking them into account. Analysis of low-priced railroad bonds. A study of speculatively priced railroad bonds will properly include consideration of many factors in addition to those just discussed. Under our broad principles of arrangement, consideration of this subject should be deferred to our later chapter on speculative senior securities. It seems preferable to deal with it here, however, in order not to break up our treatment of railroad bond analysis. Many bond buyers may be moved also to carry the analysis of investment issues further than we suggest is necessary, and to be guided in their selection among all eligible issues by more detailed considerations of operating, traffic, and financial statistics. More exhaustive study of a railroad bond issue falls under two headings. 1. The showing and prospects of the road as a whole, and 2. The position of the individual bond issue. Under the first division will come, in addition to the basic points already outlined, such matters as the character of the traffic and the efficiency of operation. Character of traffic. On this score, a significant change in viewpoint has been forced on the investor in the last generation. Formerly, chief emphasis was laid upon diversification of traffic and upon a liberal percentage of better-paying classes, for example, miscellaneous and less than carload lot shipments. More recent developments have proved this older viewpoint unsound. The higher rate classes of traffic have turned out to be especially vulnerable to truck competition, and some of the roads with the choicest quality of traffic have fallen behind most since 1929. At the other extreme, we find that the few consistently profitable carriers have been mainly the eastern soft coal lines, Chesapeake and Ohio, Norfolk and Western, Virginian, and to a lesser extent Western Maryland, which have concentrated on a single type of low-rate freight movement which they have been able to handle with extraordinary economy. By contrast, the anthracite carriers have had a very disappointing and difficult time due to a severe decline in the use of hard coal because of fuel oil competition. The complete change in the relative position of the hard and the soft coal carriers between 1923 and 1938 is shown graphically in the table that may be found in the accompanying PDF, and constitutes a warning to the security buyer not to accept the present or the past as a guarantee of the future. This warning may be applicable to the soft coal roads themselves, whose prosperity could conceivably vanish as did that of the anthracite carriers. The contrast between the continuing depression in the bituminous industry and the dazzling prosperity of the soft coal carriers may have significance for the future. Because of the loss of light traffic to motor trucks and of passenger traffic to automobiles and buses, the railroads as a whole have become more dependent than formerly on heavy traffic. For example, coal, iron and steel, other minerals, stone, sand, etc. Their prosperity is more tied up than formerly with activity in the capital goods industries. Hence, taken as a whole, they are now handicapped both by a definite diminution of their average traffic and by an added degree of year-to-year variability in the traffic that remains. It is not difficult, perhaps, to obtain a clear view of the traffic situation as it has developed on the railroads generally and on the individual lines. But the application of this knowledge to the future and the selection of specific bond or stock issues based thereon is far from a simple process. It may be assumed that traffic developments to date are fully reflected in both operating results and security prices. Can the investor go further and form a dependable judgment as to what classes of business are due to suffer still greater losses to competitors, which ones are relatively immune, and which may even be built up or regained? It is undoubtedly part of the speculator's function to arrive at conclusions on such matters as these. But we must express doubt whether the facts and their implications are sufficiently definite to form a basis for what may properly be called an investment judgment. Hence, we must reiterate our view that the purchase of railroad bonds for investment must be motivated primarily by an adequate margin of safety actually demonstrated, and that expectations as to future traffic developments should play only a cautionary role. Operating efficiency. The measures of operating efficiency generally considered are the following: operating ratio, transportation ratio, average train load and car load, average car miles per day, ratio of empty mileage to total mileage, fuel consumption per locomotive mile. The operating ratio is the ratio of all operating expenses, excluding taxes, to gross revenues. The transportation ratio applies only to those costs classified as transportation expenses. In our opinion, a more useful criterion than either of these would be the ratio to gross of all operating expenses except maintenance, but including taxes. This might be called the other operating expense ratio. Maintenance outlays are separated because they are generally regarded as an indication of the liberality rather than the efficiency of the management. Allowance must, of course, be made for the lower maintenance requirements of some carriers in relation to their revenues. For example, the soft coalers. Some studies may also be attempted to determine whether a given road is accomplishing a physical unit of maintenance cheaply or expensively, but this is a difficult subject on which to reach dependable conclusions. The other items are self-explanatory: a high average train load and car load, high car mileage per day, low mileage of empties, low fuel consumption are all obvious desiderata. However, the usefulness of these data is diminished by the fact that they are all pretty well reflected in the transportation ratio, so that one must beware of emphasizing the same point twice. It may also be an open question if a road making a rather poor showing in these respects may not present a more rather than a less attractive opportunity, provided these disadvantages are fully reflected in the price of its securities, since it may be easier to produce improvement in the future precisely because its performance is substandard. These observations apply also to two intermediate factors: the traffic density, ton miles carried per mile of road, and the average length of haul per ton. These figures relate to the character of the traffic, but their influence shows itself largely in the operating ratio. The specific security. As long as a road seems certain to remain solvent with ample margins to spare, all its obligations may be viewed almost as a unit, and the difference in value between one fixed value security and another is relatively minor. With the first threat of trouble, this difference begins to take on great significance. Attention is then directed, 1, to the character of the mileage securing the bond, and 2, to the order of its lien thereon. The necessity of careful study in such cases of the specific position of so-called underlying bonds and divisional liens was emphasized at the end of Chapter 6. In studies of this kind, the freight traffic density charts will prove of great value, though it must be pointed out that these are not readily accessible to ordinary analysts. Insolvent roads are frequently required to segregate the earnings and expenses applicable to the various mortgage liens to determine the contribution of each issue to the earning power of the system. Such data are usually made the basis of the treatment to be accorded these issues in the reorganization plan. Public utility bond analysis. The popularity of public utility securities between 1926 and 1929 resulted in an enormous increase in the amount of such financing, but this increased quantity was accompanied by a definite retrogression in the standards of quality and in the methods of presentation employed by the issuing houses. Investment bankers, including some of the highest reputation, followed entirely indefensible practices in their offering circulars, in order to make the issues appear safer than they actually were. Of these objectionable devices, the most important were: 1. The application of the term public utility to industrial operations; 2. The use of the prior deductions method of stating the earnings coverage; and 3. The ignoring of depreciation in calculating the net earnings available for bond interest. 1. Abuse of the term public utility. Just what constitutes a public utility enterprise may be the subject of some controversy. In its strict definition, it would be any enterprise supplying an essential service to the public, subject to the terms of a franchise and to continuous regulation by the state. While steam railroads are in fact a public utility undertaking, it is convenient and customary to place them in a separate category. From the investment standpoint, the most important idea associated with a public utility is that of stability, based first upon the rendering of an indispensable and generally exclusive service to a large number of customers, and secondly, upon the legal right to charge a rate of compensation sufficient to yield a fair return on the invested capital. It must be borne in mind that this stability is relative rather than absolute, since it is not immune from basic changes or unexpected vicissitudes. 20 years ago, the leading type of utility was the street railway, but this industry is now subject to such severe competition from other forms of local transportation that in most communities it is not practicable to set the fare high enough to return reasonable earnings on the actual investment. Furthermore, during the war inflation period of 1918 to 1920, the light and power companies suffered keenly from rising labor and material costs, together with difficulties and delays in obtaining permission to advance rates proportionately. These hardships had, for a time, an adverse effect upon the popularity of all utility investments, but the subsequent brilliant expansion of both gross and net earnings of gas, electric, water, and telephone companies speedily restored their securities to favor. It is to three of these services, viz., gas, electric, and telephone, that the utility investments of savings banks